Good afternoon. We are back in the Duke Energy Joint IRP hearing under 2023-8E and 2023-10E. We are now in the case being presented by the Office of Regulatory Staff. The first witness of regulatory staff has now been cross-examined by Duke Energy's, and we would proceed as to any other cross-examination. Is there any cross-examination from Sierra Club?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
CCL SACE?
No questions.
All right. Sasiba?
Sorry, I turned it off instead of on. No questions for Sasiba, but thank you.
Walmart?
No questions, thank you.
All right. Then we will move to commissioner questions. Any commissioner questions? Commissioner Caston.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Wellborn.
First, I'm sorry. Let me state for the record that all commissioners are present and all parties are available. You may proceed.
Ms. Wellborn, can you hear me?
I can. Good afternoon, Commissioner.
Good. In Duke's 2020 IRP, they ran a base plan model without carbon policy, with carbon policy, and a 70% CO2 reductions. Do you recall that?
I was not involved in the 2020 IRP. Mr. Hayat, who you'll speak to next, was, but I'm generally aware of some of the changes that have happened over the past few proceedings.
Well, I'll wait on Mr. Hayat. Relative to reserve margins, are there reserve margin alternatives?
In terms of methodologies for deriving the reserve margin, I think we've heard from some of the parties that, the reserve margin outputs, are a function of the inputs. And so to the extent that you would change those inputs, you could get a different reserve margin target, and you could develop a different ELCC representation of the resources that are used to meet that reserve margin. So I suppose the answer is yes. Mr. Hayat, again, would probably be able to answer specific questions about reserve margin, but I did address some of the ELCC in my testimony.
Okay, if it's okay with you, I'll just wait for Mr. Hayat. Is that all right?
Of course, I'm happy to answer what I can, get you to the right answers.
I appreciate that, but based on those comments, it seems more appropriate for me to ask him, and I understand that, and that's okay, as long as you don't feel slighted by that.
I do not feel slighted.
Thank you, Ms. Wellborn.
Any further commissioner questions? Commissioner Belser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Ms. Wellborn. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for your work on this case and your testimony in this proceeding. I just wanted to know, with regard to the recommendation B1 that I think you've indicated has been worked out between the company and ORS, and that there's an agreement of a confidential report on an annual basis. Are you with me?
Yes, for the economic development list?
Yes.
Yes.
Is there a date by which that report will be provided? Do you know?
As I understand it, it would be a part of, these IRP proceedings. So annually in an IRP update or a comprehensive IRP. So I don't know if a specific date has been determined, but it would be current with
Contemporaneously with the filing of an update or an IRP or comprehensive?
That's my understanding, and that I think is our expectation.
Okay, so that would, I understand that it will be marked confidential. That would be available to the commissioners, to the commission as well as part of the filing. Is that your understanding?
I think so. I want to say that the company's testimony provided some considerations for confidentiality in that they wanted to provide some information under seal. So to the extent that that may be unavailable to some parties, but available to ORS, I think that's something we would.
Well, and I'll tell you where I'm going with this is, I think a lot of times we say, oh, well, you know, we need a report, please do a report, people agree. I just think we need to start looking at some specificity of when those things are gonna be filed, just so that there's no misunderstanding later on. I mean, I appreciate y'all working this out, I really do. But, just wanna understand that there are some parameters where people can expect things. So
No,
that's.
I think ORS appreciates that. Our recommendations have tried to provide some of that recommendation language, you know, to say IRP updates, future IRPs, because we do want to see those periodically and in conjunction with this process so that it can be fully reviewed and put into context with the plans. So.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you clarifying some things for me. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Belzer. Any further commissioner questions? Hearing none, any redirect, ORS?
No redirect, thank you.
Well, thank you. Ms. Welborn?
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. You may step down. Call your next witness.
Chair Powers, ORS calls Mr. Phil Hayett to the stand. He will be appearing virtually.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Mr. Hayek, could you raise your right hand, please? You have solemnly affirmed the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Thank you very much. Your witness.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hayett.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Philip Hayett.
Mr. Hayett, did you prepare cause to be prepared 39 pages of confidential and redacted pre-file rebuttal testimony in these dockets on August 30th, 2024?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to your pre-file rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
And if I were to ask you the same questions as those posed in your pre-file rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Mr. Chair, I move that the pre-file rebuttal testimony of Mr. Hayett be read into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-file rebuttal testimony of Mr. Hayett will be entered into record as if given orally from the stand.
And ORS also asks that the confidential version of his rebuttal testimony remain under seal.
The confidential version shall remain under seal as long as necessary.
Mr. Hayett, did you prepare a summary of your pre-file rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would you please present that at this time?
Yes. Good afternoon, Commissioners. In my direct testimony, I mentioned that ORS identified 19 recommendations, and I addressed 10 of them. I previewed that of the 10 recommendations I addressed, ORS considered 4 to have been resolved, 2 to have been resolved with clarification, and 4 that are still unresolved. I begin by discussing the 4 resolved items, including recommendations 1, F1, F3, and F6. Recommendation 1 addressed 3 compliance items and proposed Duke Energy seek relief from the Commission whenever it modifies assumptions and methodologies that the Commission previously ordered that should be changed. For each of these 3 items, ORS identified, and one additional item Duke Energy identified, Duke Energy sought relief from the prior Commission requirements. ORS reviewed Duke Energy's request and justification and did not object to Duke Energy's request. Recommendation F1 related to ORS's concern that Duke Energy's wind and SMR resources have not yet proven to be commercially viable in the Carolinas, though Duke Energy developed a preferred portfolio heavily dependent on those, with plans to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on development costs in the near term. ORS recommended Duke Energy explain in rebuttal testimony the impacts on its preferred portfolio if those resources prove to be less feasible than expected or more expensive than current projections. While Duke provided the requested explanations and ORS considers this recommendation resolved, ORS still has concerns regarding the timing and reliance on these resources, which is addressed further in the context of Recommendation F5. Recommendation F3 related to ORS's request for additional information regarding in-flight resources. ORS considers this issue resolved as Duke Energy agreed to provide information going forward, and the parties have agreed to have further discussions regarding the necessary information. ORS requested Duke Energy initiate engagement with the ORS, preferably before the next IRP update is filed. Recommendation F6 related to Duke Energy's Bad Creek 2 pump storage expansion economic analysis, in which ORS sought additional analytical support regarding the analysis. Duke Energy provided the additional analysis which satisfied ORS's concern. ORS considers this issue resolved. Now I will discuss the two resolved with clarification recommendations, A1 and F7. Recommendation A1 related to ORS's concern that Duke Energy failed to address the requirement of meeting current and future capacity needs as required by Act 62. This is because the winter planning reserve margin target ranges from just 18.5% to 21.4% between 2024 and 2030, which is below Duke Energy's 22% reliability target. ORS recommended Duke Energy resolve this by providing an explanation of all reasonable and prudent steps it plans to take to mitigate reliability risks. Duke Energy explained the steps, including performing uprates, extending contracts where possible, and conducting an RFI. ORS believes these are important, but stated that Duke Energy should also consider conducting a short-term capacity and energy RFP to acquire additional resources. ORS continues to believe RFPs would provide value and discusses this issue further in the context of Recommendation F8. Recommendation F7 also relates to Bad Creek 2, the Bad Creek 2 project. ORS recommended Duke provide ongoing construction project status reports in IRP and IRP updates, and proposed an updated economic analysis be performed if the projected costs are expected to exceed the current estimate by more than 15%. Duke Energy agreed, but stated in rebuttal testimony it would only provide status reports when the 15% threshold was exceeded. However, ORS requested that status reports be provided annually in each IRP. It appears from listening to company witness Benjamin Smith testify at hearing that Duke Energy may be willing to provide status reports in each IRP as ORS requested. Finally, I will discuss the 4 items that remain unresolved: F2, F4, F5, and F8. Recommendation F2 proposed that in the 2025 IRP update, Duke Energy evaluate optimal retirement dates for the Blues Creek and Mayo 1 units without the requirement that all coal units must retire by 2036. Duke Energy asserted that due to financial, reliability, and regulatory risk to customers, it was appropriate to assume all coal units would have to retire by 2036. ORS considers the 2036 date to be arbitrary and notes the Clean Air Section 111 final rule allows coal units with gas co-firing to continue to operate until 2039, which Blues Creek is capable of doing. ORS continues to recommend optimal retirement dates should be addressed in the 2025 IRP update. Recommendation F4 proposed Duke Energy continue to perform Minimax regret analyses and include CO2 price as a key risk variable in future IRP and IRP updates. Duke Energy agreed to continue to perform this analysis along with other risk analyses. However, Duke Energy asserted it would only provide these analyses in comprehensive IRPs when multiple portfolios will be developed and assessed. ORS disagrees. Section 40D1 defines requirements for annual updates. It identifies a minimum set of items to be updated and requires the utility to describe the impact of the updated assumptions on the selected resource plan. Risk analysis is an important means of evaluating impacts of assumptions on selected resource plans. ORS recommends Duke perform Minimax regret analysis in both IRPs and IRP updates. Recommendation F5 initially proposed Duke Energy develop an alternative to portfolio SPA P3 fall base that would account for CO2 cost risk, but would not be constrained to meet a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions by an arbitrary year, such as 2035. This is consistent with the way Duke Energy and other South Carolina utilities have created portfolios in previous IRP analyses. When Duke Energy put forth its rebuttal testimony, it did not develop this case, but the companies did develop other cases addressing the Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule that were of particular interest. From the additional cases, ORS determined that indeed there may be other cases besides P3 that more appropriately balance customer affordability, commodity price risk, and diversity of gas supply while complying with applicable state and federal environmental regulations and maintain reliability. After examining the company's Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule runs, ORS determined it would still be useful for the Commission to receive additional information to compare to Duke Energy's SPA P3 fall base case. In ORS's testimony, it proposed a revision to recommendation F5. So at this point, ORS is now requesting a different result, a different run that we previously requested in direct testimony, and that still seeks an additional case, but it is another Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule sensitivity case. ORS recommended the companies develop a resource plan designed to strictly comply with the Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule requirements without constraining the case to achieve an interim CO2 emission reduction target. Finally, recommendation F8 proposed Duke Energy take all reasonable and prudent measures following the 2023 IRP to identify generation resources to support its load forecast beyond 2030. These steps may include, but would not be limited to, conducting an all-source RFP to acquire additional long-term capacity resources. ORS considers an all-source RFP to be a best practice in the utility industry and is routinely conducted by other utilities across the country. In my rebuttal testimony, I acknowledged the company's concerns, and I gave several examples where all-source RFPs are conducted by utilities, including by Georgia Power and Kentucky Power, and I discussed how the Louisiana Public Service Commission has found that a competitive solicitation process leads to the acquisition of capacity at the least cost while allowing for the use of other public interest project selection criteria. It would be reasonable for Duke Energy to conduct an all-source RFP for resources with in-service dates beyond 2030, as time constraints should not be a factor. For example, the company's plans call for a combined cycle resource to be added after 2030, cited in South Carolina. Furthermore, by conducting RFPs, utilities gain valuable insights that can then inform costs and other inputs that can then be fed into the modeling performed in IRPs. ORS continues to recommend Duke Energy take all reasonable and prudent measures following the 23 IRP to identify optimal generation resources to support its long-term resource needs, including considering conducting all-source RFPs. And this concludes my summary.
Mr. Head, in your summary when discussing recommendation F8, you stated in my rebuttal testimony. Did you mean in your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chair Powers, Mr. Head is available for questions from the parties and commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. Mr. Head, before we start cross-examination, could you adjust your screen a little bit? You're kind of down in the corner, and I want to make sure that the court reporter and that parties can see your face.
Does that help?
Much better, much
Okay.
much better. Thank you very much. All right, cross-examination, Duke.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hayett.
Good afternoon.
Brett Schwartz on behalf of the companies again. Nice to see you today.
Nice to see you.
All right, I'd like to start off with a couple general questions. You stated in your testimony that you reviewed all of Duke's rebuttal testimony that was filed in the case. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so
was
that-
a lot of it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I said there was a lot of it.
That's what I was going to highlight. So that was 18 witnesses the companies presented in the rebuttal case.
Yes, so don't ask me to quote a specific line.
I understand, but would you agree that the company presented a robust rebuttal case that comprehensively addressed the testimony of ORS interveners?
Yes, I would say the company made a very strong attempt to do that, yes.
Thank you. And both from a modeling standpoint, from resource adequacy, from grid edge and EEDSM to all of the various technologies in the near-term action plan, the companies filed testimony to support the reasonableness of the company's IRP and what they were presenting to the commission as the most reasonable and prudent plan. Would you agree with that?
I would say the company attempted to do exactly that, yes.
Thank you, sir. So I want to start off on page 14 of your testimony, if I could please. This relates to your recommendation F1. Let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
Thank you. And your recommendation F1 recommend the company in rebuttal testimony and explain the impacts of the preferred plan if offshore wind, onshore wind, SMR resources are delayed or proved to be less feasible or more expensive than currently projected in the plan. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And the company in their rebuttal case across a number of witnesses, Mr. LaRoche, Mr. Capps, Mr. McIntyre, addressed the feasibility and the cost estimates for these various technologies, correct?
Correct.
And one of the things that you point out, just probably anecdotally, is that so far the Duke companies are the only utility in South Carolina that has identified offshore wind, OSW, or SMR small modular reactors in its 15-year resource plan, though this could change in the future. You see that?
Yes, I stated that.
Yep. And are you familiar with other utilities outside of South Carolina that have identified these technologies in their resource plan?
Yes.
Both as resources that are available to the model, they're technologically mature enough that they could be selected, as well as resources that have been selected?
I do have to tell you that I haven't really seen some of them selected, though I've seen them available to be selected.
So offshore wind?
I've seen them modeled, but I haven't seen them selected yet.
Okay. Well, are you familiar with Dominion Energy Virginia's most recent IRP?
Yes, but like I said, I haven't. I thought that you were asking me about cases that I've participated in, and I haven't participated in the Dominion case, but I'm aware that offshore wind is being constructed, is going to be a resource that'll be available in Virginia.
And okay, well, I'm not trying to trip you up here. I can move on from that. Subject to check, would you agree that other utilities across the country have identified these resources as selectable resources and then selected them as part of their modeled portfolios? Would you agree with that?
You know, again, a few. Maybe maybe Virginia. We know there's at least one other on the East Coast. Nothing in the Gulf. We work a lot with Entergy. They haven't selected it yet. You know, you might assume that they would have, or could, but they haven't selected it. So it's not been selected very much.
Fair enough. Well, considering there's a half dozen offshore wind projects that are under various phases of construction in the Northeast, you would agree that that has been evaluated and selected in other IRPs, correct?
I would agree with that.
All right. So want to return specifically to South Carolina. Are you familiar with Santee Cooper's most recent 2024 IRP update that was filed last Monday, September 16th? Have you had an opportunity to preliminarily review that?
You know, I've looked at it, but I haven't looked at it in any detail. Just I've taken a peek at it.
Okay. In your preliminary review of that, are you aware that onshore wind, offshore wind, as well as small modular reactor nuclear were selectable resources available to the model in that utilities IRP update?
I can't say that I'm fully aware of all those, but I am aware from my brief review that I saw some of those.
Okay, and that Santee Cooper also selected onshore wind as part of its resource plan, with that initial 100 megawatts of onshore wind to be projected to achieve commercial operation in 2031?
Yes, and that was the one I was referring to.
Okay, great. And they also identified 500 megawatts more onshore wind to be selected in their plan between 2032 and 2040.
I'm not aware. I took such a quick look at their IRP.
Understood. No, that's fine. And just for scale purposes, do you recall the conversation that I had with Mr. Hamilton Davis the other day that the Duke system is substantially larger than the Santee Cooper or the Dominion system? It's approximately 32,000 megawatt peak demand versus 5,400 megawatt peak demand.
Yes, I'm generally aware that you're substantially larger, or Duke Energy is substantially larger than Santee Cooper. Yes.
Okay, so from a comparability standpoint, when Duke is looking at 300 megawatts of onshore wind in 2031, that compares reasonably favorably to the 100 megawatts that Santee Cooper has identified in their plan. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, it does. I mean, the timing, you know, you could pick a specific date to look at it, but that compares to the timing.
Okay, thank you. And Did you have a chance in the proceeding?
Could I make one more comment?
Please.
We're not saying that these resources should not be selected. We're not saying that these resources aren't in other IRPs or shouldn't be considered. If we set up an IRP, we would consider certain resources such as these. Making a commitment to something like onshore wind to the magnitude that you did. I can remember a Georgia Power IRP, they considered a pilot project. They didn't launch into consideration to the scale and scope that Duke Energy has on resources that far out that have never been done before. That's kind of what we're trying to say, is that the magnitude of what you're planning here, sitting here in 2024, which has never been done in the Carolinas, is significant. And Duke acknowledges that it's significant, but there are other steps that can be taken. A pilot could be taken to look at, certain resources before full commitments. And on top of that, $600 million is being spent in 2024 on these resources, 25, 26 on these resources that aren't going to happen till in the 2030 timeframe.
Now,
so that is to a certain large extent, concerns that we have about the plan.
yeah, Mr. Hayden, now to be clear, the model selected in the supplemental planning analysis, that amount of offshore wind as part of the least cost plan based on the P3 fall-based portfolio, correct?
The model selected based on inputs that the company has acknowledged over and over again that you've done the best effort you could possibly do, and we're not saying you haven't, but you're saying it's the best effort you could possibly do to know what the costs are as of this moment in time.
Understood, sir.
We recognize that over time, the better costs are going to be developed, better analysis is going to be determined, but to put this much in and tell the commission that you have to have the commission, essentially to pick a word, bless this plan today and has certain cost recovery implications down the line. We want to make sure that it's clear that the company is the party coming up and deciding how much money to spend on this plan at this point in time and what steps to take, and the company has to be responsible for all of that.
And Mr. Hayat, to be clear, the company's model selected 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind, but the company's plans for execution between now and the next IRP are to spend a little over $1 million on an acquisition RFI. Isn't that correct? The company hasn't.
Now we're talking about offshore wind, and that's correct for offshore wind. But you're planning to spend on the order of $600 million when you take all the long-term resources that you're considering. And that's going to be spent in the next few years.
Mr. Hayat, the company's identified what their plans are and what they're going to spend funds on for onshore wind, which is approximately $65 million on a system basis, correct?
Yes.
And then it's approximately $400 million for small modular reactor development on a system basis over the next 3 years, correct?
Yes.
And it's approximately $1 million, 1.4 if I recall correctly, for this RFI for offshore wind, correct?
Yes, 1.4.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to turn now to page 21 of your testimony, if I could please, sir. This is where you're discussing the coal retirement analysis and specifically page 21, line 5, and you addressed this in your summary as well. And you said that in your opinion, ORS views the 2036 mandatory coal retirement date identify the company as arbitrary. You recall that testimony?
Yes.
So explain to me, when you say arbitrary, I looked it up in the dictionary. It seems to be it's based on preference or convenience rather than by necessity or having any intrinsic nature of something that is informed by some quantitative or qualitative analysis. You think that's fair?
I haven't looked it up, but I will accept
Okay,
that.
well, what's your definition of arbitrary since you've
I
used
will
the term in
accept
your
that as a
testimony?
reasonable definition of arbitrary.
Okay. And it's your testimony that the companies haven't presented any quantitative or qualitative explanation through their testimony for why they have determined that all coal units should retire by 2036. Is that, when you say it's arbitrary, is that what you're telling the commission?
No, I didn't say that. The sentence before the sentence that says arbitrary reads that the Duke witness stated it believes it's unreasonable for planning purposes to model coal retirements beyond 2036, given the increasing financial reliability and regulatory risk. I certainly accept that the company has attempted to look to identify factors that it believes, but I suppose the date 2036 is the issue that I'm saying is a bit arbitrary, but why isn't that 2037? Why isn't that 2038, 2039? I mean, how can the company possibly come here in 2024 and say there'll be no market? There's going to be such significant reliability risk that by 2036 the coal markets are going to evaporate. Transportation is going to be gone. We're going to be unable to acquire coal as of January 1st, 2036. And therefore, in our model, we're going to look at no other dates. We're not going to do sensitivity analysis. We're not going to consider anything but 2036. That's my reason for choosing the word arbitrary.
And what analysis have you presented to support that it's arbitrary in this case? Have you presented any quantitative or qualitative analysis to support an alternative coal retirement recommendation?
I can answer that. For one thing, if we turn to the report, the ORS report, and I'll provide you a page in a second. And this is confidential information, so I don't want to risk revealing any confidential information. But
Thank you for flagging that.
Page 68, 69, if you look at the graphs that are on page 68, 69 of the ORS report, what you see these are the company's coal price forecasts. And the company's coal price forecasts effectively show nothing falling off the cliff. No, we would expect to see, and what other assessment we looked at, you can tell that we looked at not just the company's forecast, but we compared to other utilities' coal price forecasts. And we've heard the company state that the prices are going to be, higher. We don't see that from these coal price forecasts. We see, stability in the coal price, in the coal market. We don't see the coal falling off a cliff in 2036. And that's the kind of thing that if the company itself believed it, or some other utilities believe that the coal market is going to evaporate, we would expect to see a much more volatile, spiky behavior in the forecast.
Mr. Hayat, thank you for that. I want to refer you to the testimony of Mr. Verderame. Did you have an opportunity to hear his testimony to the commission?
Yes, I don't have that in front of me, but
Were you able to see it on the screen here, sir?
if you can make it larger, because I think you're just focusing on an area.
Okay. Yes, sir. I've tried to highlight the area there. Are you able to see that?
Yeah.
And it's your understanding that Mr. Verderame is the Vice President of Fuels and System Operations for the companies?
I understand that.
And so he has responsibility for managing the fuel supply, the commodities of coal, natural gas, procurement for the companies, and evaluating the future coal markets that the companies are contracting in today, both today and for the future.
Yes.
All right. And so his testimony and the analysis presented by the company says your response to his testimony fails to account for the reliability risk and customer cost risks associated with keeping the company's legacy coal plants running in perpetuity, and highlights the companies did not constrain the retirement analysis by CO2 reduction constraints, but placed these firm retirement dates of 2036 based on the reliability and cost risk that continuing to operate the company's coal fleet beyond that point would pose for South Carolina customers. Do you see that?
Yes.
And did you also review Appendix F to the plan, which identified the company's assessment of the qualitative and quantitative risks of the future coal market and why the companies have concerns with the aging coal fleet continuing into the mid-2030s?
I do, and I've already told you that I think that's inconsistent with the company modeling of the coal price forecast. And on top of that, that's inconsistent with EPA 111 indicating that there are pathways for the utilities to operate coal units beyond 2036.
Okay, so it's your testimony that the EPA got it right and they know what date the company's coal plants can operate until more than Mr. Verderame and the other subject matter experts that presented to the commission?
Well, I'm not going to sit here. I'm not going to answer that question, but I will answer the question that once again, if the company got it right, then the coal forecast is certainly not indicative of the company getting it right.
Okay. Did the commission get it right when they approved the depreciation schedules in the most recent rate cases that have all of those coal units retiring by 2036 and earlier?
Well, we could go to that, or I could ask you, did the company get it right when they put in the table in Appendix B that shows the remaining life of the units, and they go, for example, another 12 years on Mayo, which is beyond where the company is assuming that Mayo is going to operate. So did the company get that wrong? Why does the company's remaining life on coal units show that you could operate units such as Mayo longer?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir.
It's part of the company's Appendix B.
Yep, I don't have that in front of me, and I think our subject matter experts could probably address that. But to close this out, you've not presented any quantitative or qualitative analysis to support extending the coal retirement schedule beyond 2036. Is that correct?
No, we think it's a reasonable request and information that we think that this commission should have, particularly in light of the fact that EPA 111 allows for units to operate. There's a pathway to allow coal units to operate on gas beyond 2036.
Okay. I'd like to turn to page 24 of your testimony. I could please, sir. And so this is where you're addressing the Minimax regret analysis recommendation. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And this is one where the ORS and the companies are generally aligned. Agree with that? Or
Yeah, I'm on page 24.
Thank you. Allow me 1 minute to put it on the screen here for the commission. And so in Mr. Quinto's testimony, the companies agreed to continue providing the Minimax in future comprehensive IRPs, including evaluating CO2 price risk as requested by the ORS. But the one area of disagreement is your recommendation to provide the Minimax regret in future IRP updates. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And at line 21 here, or the answer on 20 to 21, you characterize it as the company discontinuing providing Minimax regret in IRP updates. You see that?
Yes.
And are you aware the company has not previously presented Minimax regret in their IRP updates, that in the 22 IRP update, the company's only updated the selected A2 portfolio and presented that analysis to the commission consistent with provision D1 of the IRP statute?
You know, I may have made a mistake on that. We've dealt with a few utilities and their IRP updates, and I had thought that the company did do it. So I can reword that to say simply the company is stating that it would not agree to provide it in IRP update, in future IRP updates.
Correct. And I think more broadly than the words you used there, the concept of the IRP update is appropriate to update the inputs and assumptions in the selected plan, and that is consistent with Section D1 of the IRP statute. You would agree with that?
Yes, but if we looked at D1, it has a laundry list of items, and it states that the utility is supposed to evaluate the impacts of those, and we believe that risk analysis is the proper way to evaluate the impact, and that's and it's reasonable to perform Minimax analysis for that purpose.
And is it your request, just to make sure I understand it on behalf of the companies, that they update for the selected portfolio those inputs and assumptions, and so that's what's being updated in the IRP update? You're not asking the company to rerun the entirety of the 53 portfolios and 400 runs that were done, or approximately,
right, in
the IRP update. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I am not asking for that. However, I don't think that the company should foreclose the possibility of presenting other portfolios in an IRP update. It depends on the circumstances that come up. And so depending on the circumstances, for example, if the company found that it needed to be compliant with EPA regulations and it required significant effort or some amount of effort to evaluate that, then because of those circumstances, I think it's reasonable. You could have multiple portfolios, and you might want to evaluate those portfolios based on a risk assessment. So I don't think it's unreasonable at the time of an IRP update to conduct the risk analysis.
But Mr. Hayat, you said that might be a circumstance that would be appropriate based on future circumstances. And what I think the company is concerned is your recommendation will become a binding directive in a future commission order, where in all IRP updates, they would have to present a Minimax regret analysis as that compares an updated selected plan to a bunch of old stale plans, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So it doesn't sound like that's what you're recommending, and this shouldn't be something that's binding.
And what we're concerned about is you would never do it.
Well, fair enough. It's good we had this conversation, and I had a conversation with Ms. Welburn earlier about potentially discussing with ORS in advance of the next IRP if we could get to more pragmatic solutions for some of the ORS's recommendations. Is this another one where some of those stakeholder type discussions with the ORS would be beneficial?
I would think that's a reasonable resolution.
Okay, thank you, sir. One additional area that I want to explore with you with your testimony. When we spoke last week, we had a discussion about your firm, J. Kennedy & Associates, capability to perform modeling, capacity expansion, production cost modeling. You recall that?
Yes.
And you agreed that your firm has extensive experience and does modeling for other utilities and clients in IRPs and other proceedings, correct?
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
And you also, sorry?
And has over time, yes.
Thank you, sir. And you also agreed that you or your firm either downloaded or received access to Duke's Encompass modeling files and performed a limited amount of modeling to validate the accuracy of Duke's IRP. Is that correct?
Yes.
And just, I went back and listened again, and you said, we conducted evaluations, we reviewed the models, we ran the models, we validated the models, we recreated the models. We even conducted at time our own investigations of runs. Does that sound generally consistent with your testimony, or at least your past experience of reviewing
Yes,
and doing modeling?
Yes.
And just explain to me and the commission, when you say we ran the models and we performed our own investigation of runs, what does that mean?
Well, first of all, at times we wanted to evaluate input assumptions, and we may have looked at sensitivity to a certain assumption and made a run. In another case, I think that we were interested in knowing how the model might respond to a different set of inputs, and we did make our own runs. We at no point felt that any of the runs we created we were prepared to put forth as alternatives to the companies. That we recognized that was the company's responsibility. So we did do a run, one or more runs. You'd have to probably ask Ms. Wellborn how many runs in total were performed. However, we did do at one point runs to look at an alternative, but we did it in a way that we would never prepare and submit for any put forth, nor was that something that we were asked to do by the ORS. The ORS asked us to evaluate the company's analysis, and that's what we did, and that's consistent with what we have done in the entire, all the cases that we have done for all the utilities, including Duke, prior to this. So everything we did in this case is consistent with what we have done in the past. We have not changed our approach to the evaluation of this case.
Thank you. And just to confirm, when you say runs, that's developing a portfolio that's essentially similar to the 53 portfolios the company developed in this proceeding, was based on a modeling run. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. So you essentially developed an alternative portfolio at some phase of your evaluation of the company's IRP in this case.
We did. It was not something, we did it in a way that we were not prepared to put forth. We were not asked to put forth because we were asked to do evaluations of the work that the company did. And so that, because we wanted to be in the past, we wanted to remain consistent with what we've done in the past. It could change in the future, but our directive was to review the compliance and evaluate the IRP and identify areas of issues that we've identified as our recommendations, and we would much prefer that the company can put forth a case and say that, look, we're doing this case at the request of ORS, because ORS believes this is important information that the commission might want to see. I can't believe the company would want to withhold valuable information that the commission might want to see, but the company certainly, I think Ms. Smith said that that the company might show information that it believes is accurate, but it's not, even if it provides information, it's not necessarily information that it's going to give it a stamp of approval on. It might have been somebody else, and I might be getting the person wrong, but basically the statement was that we're putting forth our recommendation. If we show something else, we're not necessarily saying that we agree with that, but that doesn't mean that that's not valuable information for this commission to see.
Thank you,
That's
Mr. Hayes.
what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you. And just to confirm, you had the capability to do the modeling, you ran the modeling, you developed a portfolio, but as the consultant, you were never requested to present a portfolio, an alternative portfolio or alternative plan to the commission, correct?
Because that's the burden that the company has
And
to put forth.
are you are generally familiar, you worked in the number of utilities IRPs, you're generally familiar with the IRP statute, correct?
Yes,
And you understand that it provides in subsection C1 for reasonable discovery on both the utilities IRP and alternative plans presented by interveners. You familiar with that?
yes,
Okay. And so, one, it contemplates alternative plans being presented by interveners. Is that correct?
yeah, it has it as an allowance, yes.
Correct. And it also contemplates reasonable discovery on those alternative plans, correct?
Yes,
And so the most recent recommendation from yourself on behalf of ORS is to present an alternative plan in surrebuttal, which we're now discussing in the hearing, which will conclude without that plan being presented or reasonable discovery being allowed. You would agree with that?
well, I would agree with that to an extent, because we do know that what was presented in the company's rebuttal were the Clean Air Act cases, and essentially it showed exactly what we've been trying to say, that we believe that P0 is not appropriately risk adjusted for CO2 emissions. We believe that P3 is aggressive with so many resources that have not been installed ever in the Carolinas, and the costs that are put into the models, the company is not even sure that those are the costs that we'll ultimately see with those. And we believe that more time may be necessary, and that there is a case between P0 and P3, just exactly as we suspected. And those cases were presented through the company's Clean Air Act cases. There was a 2037 case and a 2038 case that pushed out compliance. And we also believe that it's valid information for this commission to see, what if we strictly complied with the Clean Air Act federal statutes? What would that demonstrate? And that's the case that we asked for as part of our surrebuttal testimony.
Thank you. And just more generally, it's your understanding, and based on your review, would you agree that Duke filed the same plan in South Carolina and North Carolina? There's no difference in the plans that were filed?
Yes.
And you're not aware that there is any information that the companies presented to the North Carolina Commission that they haven't transparently presented to this commission in precisely the same way. Is that accurate?
I would not know that entirely because I didn't participate in the North Carolina, but I would say that the IRP plan itself that the company presented here is the same as the plan that was presented there, but that doesn't mean that if the commission wanted additional information that it felt was important, it doesn't mean they shouldn't have the right to have that information.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hayett. Mr. Chairman, no further questions.
Thank you very much. Further cross-examination, Sierra Club.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
CCL, Sace Upstate Forever.
No questions.
Thank you. Sasiba.
No questions, but thank you.
Walmart.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners. Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Hayett.
Good afternoon, Commissioner.
I'd ask Ms. Welborn, about reserve margins, if there were alternatives. I know that's a pretty broad question, but are there any reserve margin alternatives?
Do you mean, are there any other resources that could be provided? Or do you mean to meet the requirements, the capacity requirements and reserves that the company has?
Probably both of those, but the latter part more so.
Well, I was going to say, do you mean do you mean alternatives in the way of resources that could be used to serve the requirements?
That,
I'm trying to understand how to answer. as
well, if I ask it better, you'd be able to do that. So why don't I back up and do that?
I could
let me
probably
so-
answer.
Let me circle back around to something that may lead to this,
Okay.
because I was thinking earlier, I can't remember what triggered it in the questions earlier, thinking about modeling inputs, constraints, outputs, and I think weather normalization was talked about,
Yeah.
and I was wondering if should historical weather normalization for the reserve margin study, is there any merit value? Should it match the weather sensitivity used in load forecasting for IRPs?
In terms of matching, no. I think the idea there's probably two areas in which load forecasting relative to your question comes up. One of them comes up in the notion of devising a reserve margin target itself. Another place where load forecasting comes up is in terms of once you establish what your reserve margin target is, now what is the load you use to determine and to then identify the resources that you're going to add to meet that load, and what are the additional resources to serve reserves that you're going to have above that. So you're going to have, for that aspect, you're going to have production cost modeling, and you're going to have optimization of resource analysis performed. Coming back to the first one, that's where you're deciding what the planning reserve margin target ought to be. And to that aspect, in terms of weather normalization, what you're trying to say there is that I do have a certain load forecast, and I want to just discern how reliable my system is to meet that load forecast. But I want to take in a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown factors, one of which is the load itself. What if 1987 repeated itself out in the future? The weather that we had in 1987 repeated itself out in the future. What if the weather that we had in 1990 repeated itself out in the future? And the question there is, what weather drives load? And so then we get into the question of uncertainty and load forecast error. And so when Mr. Wintermantel and Estrape and the study that was performed to determine the reserve margin target took all of that into consideration, the load forecast uncertainty, in deriving what the reserve margin target was. And I think that they and I as well would readily admit that a lot of these processes are data driven, meaning that the data input leads to the output, and then you could question whether or not that's a reasonable output. And I think we're going to see some changes as we go forward into the future, because the way the data-driven process works, and it works in this state, and they're doing similar processes in other states, you take 40 years worth of historic weather and 40 years worth of load, and some of the years are going to drop off because the 40-year period that you pick is going to change over time. So we might see, just simply because we choose a different set of 40 years, that'll influence what the reserve margin target is going to be in the future that we're going to see. And it could, I'll readily admit, it could go down. When we drop off some historic load into the future, it could go down. We also use in that uncertainty analysis of deriving the reserve margin target, we also use information about generating unit outages, because again, the goal is to figure out how reliable our system is. Generating unit outages is historic, it's certainly an input to that process, But as Winter Storm Elliott led to the utilities making vast improvements on how they operate the units and how they prevent similar outages in the future, we're going to see some of that data roll in, and that's going to have an impact on potentially lowering the reserve margin. All of this is to say that in the future, we could see a lower reserve margin in deriving the reserve margin target. Now, coming over, but if you accept that we did devise 22% ORS, ORS did not see any flaws in what the company did. And therefore, that led us to have our reserve margin recommendation that said, look, if you think it's important that you achieve 22%, my gosh, we do think you ought to strive to achieve that level of reserve margin target. We get that the company has to, it takes time to get there. We get that. We understood that with Santee Cooper. They were in the same situation, but that's why we put forth a recommendation that says, what are you going to do to mitigate any reliability issues you're going to have in the short term? And certainly one area that we suggested was, well, you could always conduct like Santee Cooper, you could always conduct an RFP process. And that led to our recommendation of, hey, you could probably get resources through an RFP process in the 24 to 2030 time period. All right, what I like to do is step over now into the second area of load forecasting, which is production, is heavily used in production cost and optimization. But now we have established what the reserve margin target ought to be from the first process. Now what's important in here is we do sensitivity analysis on load forecasts, meaning what are our production costs going to be, or what are our resource needs going to be if we have a higher or lower load forecast. And stepping back to the initial IRP that the company filed, they didn't have a very wide variation between the low and the high forecasts that would allow anybody to have a sense of confidence that they were looking at a reasonable set of resources that could be acquired, or what steps they could take if there was more or less load. And they realized also that in a very short amount of time, the load, economic development load, just exploded. And so they realized that it would require them to refile the IRP with much higher load forecasts. And then we were able to see that there's basically good variation between low, mod, high load forecasts. It gave us the ability to see how they would flexibly change their plan depending on where the load results ultimately come out as an outcome. And here we use normalized load. And essentially, we'll use a normalized low forecast, normalized mod forecast, normalized high forecast, because you can't really just put in the real variation that weather is going to cause in any minute-to-minute process, but you sort of do an averaging over a lot of weather conditions to come up with what the load forecast may be in the future. But because you can have such variation, that's why we look at a low, mod, and high. And I'm going to stop there because I've said a lot, and I'm hopeful that maybe I said something that's helping you, but maybe you have some other questions that I can expand on.
Thank you, and that was helpful, and I actually think I followed most of that. And kind of going back and trying to sum all this up in my mind to make sure I understand it, is, a 5% reserve margin addition. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, that's pretty big cost. And you and ORS don't expect to do this overnight. I mean, type change, I think I heard you say, or ORS recognizes requires time. Is correct?
It does. We recognize that it requires time. We also think that if the company absolutely believes in it, which the company has told you that they absolutely think that's the right reserve margin, then they ought to buy into trying to achieve it. I do temper that by saying you are 100% right. It does lead to higher costs. So I do appreciate your concern that if you do force them up that high, or they do force it up that high, yeah, it is going to lead to higher costs. And we can see it because, ultimately they're going to be having to make sure they acquire resources, two resources in this year instead of that one resource. And that will lead to higher costs. But if we believe in the criticality of reliability, then I think it's important. We support reliability. That's a very fundamental concept that we support. So we're not necessarily going to come out and say we think Duke made a mistake and it said its reserve margin. Unless we see a flaw, unless we see an error in the calculations, we're not going to come in here and tell you we think Duke has reserve margin target is way too high. But I do agree with you for the concern because it does lead to higher costs.
And finally, at least relative to that, something that was helpful to me, and I think it was Mr. Snyder, I can't remember who said it, but talking about the temperature weather normalization, using this data-driven process to determine reserve margin. A storm is still a storm. It's a dot of data.
Yes.
And a host of data. So unless it's significant, it's probably going to be minimal, if anything noticeable. Is that?
Well, you're 100% right. It is it is 1 out of 40, or I think the company had more than 40, but just using 40 weather years. You don't give any one of those years any more weight than you do in the process than any other. So, and yes, that dot rolls off. It can roll off because let's say it was a year way back in that 40-year process. Now you're moving forward a couple of years, and now you've got a 40-year period or more than 40-year period that you've come forward on, and that rolled off. Well, that significant year isn't going to have the influence that it had before. But again, it's tempered because it's only 1/40th or 1/50th, whatever the number of years they used is. It's not like you're weighting it with, I'm going to give it a 30% weight of that 1 year. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I'm figuring it out. 3 more questions, I think, and that's it.
Okay.
Excuse me, talked about IRPs and 2020 IRP, and I had asked Ms. Welborn this, but in Duke's 2020 IRP, they did run a base plan model without carbon and one with carbon policy, and that 70% CO2 reductions. Do you recall?
Yes, I do recall exactly.
And was the modeling software that was used for that 2020 plan the same that was used for the 2023 plan?
No, they switched over to Encompass, I believe in the 22 IRP update. And so they used different software prior to that. I'm not sure that it's the software as much as the assumptions that drive differences that we're now seeing today. But I would say that, in the 2020 IRP, the company told you that they wanted to retire all coal units by 2030. That was that was their proposal. We want to shut down all coal by 2030. And the commission ultimately ordered them to use a different preferred plan from the 2020 IRP, and they use that in the 2022 IRP update. And that plan, you know, was one because the commission believed that something different than what the company promoted was important for South Carolina. And the commission wanted to see those be used. So the commission certainly did require that in the 2020 IRP and modified IRP.
Well, relative to this one, I guess Encompass, and I'll just ask it basically. Could a base plan with no carbon policy, with 70% carbon reductions, including the Clean Air Act Rule 111 final rule, can that be run on this particular model?
Yes, Commissioner. And if I could elaborate on that, it sort of gets into the way in which this IRP has been conducted and what ORS has requested. And I think if you go back, you start with basically the August 23 IRP being filed, and they did file it with a P, what we have been calling P0, the no carbon case, and that case basically gave the information as requested. It gave information. They didn't give as much information as we felt was necessary regarding the need to evaluate the P0 case. And we basically asked for that, as we learned that the company was going to do the SPA filing, we learned that was going to be made. And I think in January, we essentially made a request that said, look, when you do this filing, give us a fully articulated case with bill impacts, looking at Minimax risk, do all of that. We ultimately got that information, and we were able to see that information, but we received it shortly before we filed our testimony on July 1st. And that information told us something. It told us that a P0 case has risks. And that's why Minimax risk analysis was helpful to us, because we were able to evaluate it, and we came to the conclusion. I'll tell you what conclusion we reached. We reached the conclusion that if capital costs are high, that's going to have a big impact on the plan that the company is putting forth. If the capital costs, which they don't know right now what they ultimately turn out to be, like Vogel, they thought it was going to be, $14 billion, it turned out to be 30. If the capital costs are not known now and they're higher, there are going to be some issues down the line for customers. But we determined from getting the fully articulated set of information with bill impacts that there are risks that we were uncomfortable with on a P0 having no consideration of carbon. And sure enough, we now have, like what Ms. Smith is telling you, and we are accepting as true, is that the law of the land right now is the Clean Air Act requirements. It's a final rule. It may get stayed. There are all kinds of legal challenges. So that's sort of telling you that CO2 is important to take into consideration. And that kind of, for us, rules out a P0. But what it doesn't rule out is something for South Carolina that could be in between P0 and P3. So when we filed our testimony, our rebuttal testimony, we basically knew that there was the Clean Air Act cases that the company had, And we asked them to effectively do another Clean Air Act case, but get rid of the 70% requirement by, 2035 or 36 or 37. Just meet the Clean Air Act. And we thought that's information that you ought to be able to see. And we think, given the urgency that the company has placed on this case and how it needs to know and it needs your affirmation on this, which we don't necessarily agree with, but given all the stressing they have done on the urgency, we think that's valid information that you should have a right to see. What is a case where the company meets the federal law of the land Clean Air Act statute? And the company, said it's willing to do it. It just hasn't provided it yet. It didn't provide it. It says by the next comprehensive IRP. We don't think we think you should see that information sooner.
Thank you, Mr. Hayat, and appreciate your answers, and I have no more questions.
Any further commissioner questions? Commissioner Williams?
Thank you, Chair Powers. Mr. Hayat, thank you for your being here and your role in helping us to get all the information. I appreciate the conversation you just concluded with Mr. Caston, and I have to admit that my brain is shot. And what I'd love for you to do is to point me to where in your testimony or in ORS's report that the portfolio that you were just describing as being reflective, I think, purely of the Clean Air Act is where you all describe what it is that you requested. Where is that found best?
Well, Commissioner, I could do that in my sort of rebuttal testimony. I think.
Is it page 26? That's why did you ask the additional analysis? So it might be.
Right. Starting on page 25, discuss ORS recommendation F5. And what I tried to do was go through a little bit of the history. And fundamentally, we were asking for the company to provide an alternative, initially to provide an alternative to the P3 fall base, and consistent with the methodology Duke and other utilities have performed in prior IRPs. That was our recommendation at the time we filed direct testimony. And and essentially, Duke did not provide that when they had the opportunity to, but what they did, and they were busy. They provided 13 other cases in rebuttal to assess the Clean Air Act. They felt those were very relevant cases to consider, and we examined those prior to us filing sort of rebuttal testimony. And so when we did that, we were able to realize that, look, we're no longer interested so much in strictly a P0 case, but we've already been able to use prior information and rule out the fact that we think P0 is a valid case, and we don't think it's valid for South Carolina. But what we did realize was that the Clean Air Act cases did lead to what we keep thinking is appropriate for South Carolina. And we've been looking at something in between P3 and P0. And the Clean Air Act cases basically gave us that. It gave us, the companies first attempted to do nothing more than the same 2035 case that they had developed with the most minimal changes they could, but to meet all the requirements of the EPA legislative rule. And they did that, and they realized they could not, it was impossible to have a 2035 date to meet a 70% interim target for North Carolina at the same time of meeting the Clean Air Act requirements. They then said, well, what if we change that North Carolina interim target to 2036? Can we meet? And then they found that still didn't work in their view. They actually got an outcome but they said it was not executable. It had flaws. They didn't like that outcome. They then changed it to 2037. And this is where we're getting to what ORS has been thinking all along, is that there's got to be something in between. And they got to a 2037, and it came to an interesting conclusion. That is that it meets federal, it meets North Carolina, it has a diverse set of resources, it's lower cost, more affordable, and reliable. And that's all within the 2037 meeting, attempt to meet the Clean Air Act requirements. Then they did another case, and they pushed out offshore wind beyond 2040. And they found out that that indeed was the lowest cost case that met federal, state, South Carolina, North Carolina, affordable result. And that's what we've been trying to say, that we're not certain that coming up with this plan that the company has that results in spending over $600 million in the next couple of years without studying these resources carefully is leading to the plan that's best for South Carolina. And so we came up with one more requested case in our rebuttal testimony, and we asked, and we think it'd be important for the commission to see, and it's a case in which it says, what would the resource plan look like if the company strictly met the law of the land, the federal statutes? What would the expansion plan look like for that? And how much might that cost customers? Or is that an affordable case? Is that reliable? Does that meet a diverse set of resources? We think that probably all of these other Clean Air Act cases that the company has presented would meet all those criteria. And we think that's important information that the commission ought to see.
And in your opinion, is there a reason that that needs to be in this IRP as opposed to an IRP update?
Well, the current company has let you know that it's extremely urgent that they get, the sense of approval that they've gotten. It's different with the cost recovery that they've gotten. The wording is different in North Carolina. You could parse the words in North Carolina. You can parse the words in South Carolina, but there is a sense of urgency that I think we all feel from this case, that the company wants to have these things. And given that urgency, we think this is important information that the commission should see. But it's up to you and the commissioners, as to timing that you feel is critical, recognizing it's true, these resources are far out in time. We think that these resources ought to be studied. No, there's no doubt about it. If I were doing an IRP, I would look at these resources, but the fact that nobody can tell you where they're going to have these offshore resources, what the cost of the resources are, they've got to do another acquisition RFI. They've got to do 100 more things on Bad Creek, on onshore wind. They don't have wind data for the onshore wind projects. Georgia Power looked at onshore wind projects as well, and they're probably going to have them in their next IRP. But they had to go out and do, get metering wind data long before they told the commission in Georgia that they think 2,400 megawatts should be in the expansion plan. So there's a lot to be studied and evaluated, and costs are going to have to be spent. The question is, $600 million by 27?
How important is using the most current data?
Extremely important. We agree with that. You have to use the most current data, and you have to continue to update. And you have to check and adjust, like the company said. We don't disagree with that.
So if we ordered this particular analysis to take place, would they not be doing it with 2023, late 2023 data?
Well, they updated a lot of data for the SPA, which filed in February of 24.
Right.
Again, you know, it's before final decisions are ever made about cost recovery, about, you know, what really should get built, you know, certainly this information is critical. I agree with you. And I think what you're trying to say is sitting here September of 24, is it absolutely critical that, but they keep putting such an importance on you saying that these resources are approved, that these resources are reasonable and prudent. And that includes timing. You know, that includes, and that includes basically saying that we think this timing is correct. We think that you'll have to spend this kind of money. You know, there's a lot of questions that could be answered before anybody comes. If anybody came to me and said, I'm spending $600 million and effectively, you know, that's what is going to happen by you saying reasonable and prudent, you know, I'd be looking for, you know, hold off now. Wait a second.
I understand. Thank you very much. I appreciate the answers.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Anything further from commissioners? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Mr. Hayat, I wanted to kind of change directions here a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion about the structure of the company and the two-state service area and other companies around the country that have you know, similar things going on. And I assume that you've heard a lot of that conversation at this point.
Yes, sir, I have.
And I was wondering if you had any other thoughts that you would like to add to that.
There's a lot I agree with. Two states operating is not an unusual situation, multi-jurisdictional. In my career, I can list Southern Company, Entergy, AEP, PacifiCorp as all the places where I've worked with multi-jurisdictional. And I can also tell you that a good part of my career has been in issues that relate to differences between the states. We are involved in Entergy and its breakup of its system agreement that involved going to FERC, and it was all about cost allocation issues. It was all about resources and the resources that different states wanted. My colleague, Ms. Wellborn, and I are involved in Utah with PacifiCorp, where PacifiCorp has 6 states, as was mentioned to you by Ms. Bateman. They have 6 states and they're going through a multi-state process on cost allocation, and it's probably the 3rd time that they're doing it. And the latest round of it is all being driven by different resources being desired by different states. You have the westernmost Oregon, especially Oregon and Washington, wanting to be completely out of coal and natural gas. And that's driving, to a large extent, cost allocation issues, IRP-related issues being discussed. And it does come down to, and I'll tell you that the same conversations we're having here, we've been having out there, that, yeah, it is more economic to have a larger system. It is more desirable to attempt to keep together, to have a single dispatch across the entirety of the system. There's no doubt about that. However, the issues are if one state wants to drive higher costs for another state. We don't want coal. We don't want gas. We want to do 100% renewable or something on that order. And other states say, look, we've got these assets. We want to transition out of these assets orderly fashion over time. Plus, it's more affordable for our customers. Then we've got to deal with that from a cost allocation direction. And so I have to say, I agree with Ms. Bateman. That you could keep the system together. It becomes a cost allocation, but that's not really a matter for an IRP. That's a matter that ought to be taken up in another forum. And there are a lot of rate experts that get involved in that kind of evaluation. But I hope I've answered your question. I don't know if it's more specific. I think I basically answered. I've been involved with other places encountering the same types of issues that we're encountering here.
Okay, and one of the other things that we heard too is that a merger of the two companies, I believe if I heard it correctly, could reduce the required reserve margin. Did you hear that?
I did hear that. I did.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, in general, merging of companies, look, I've been through a few of those as well. Savannah Electric merged with Georgia Power. In Louisiana, there was Entergy Gulf States merged with Entergy Louisiana and formed just Entergy Louisiana now. And in general, there are benefits to merging together, and there are savings. And reserve margin ought to be one of them because the diversity of the two systems. I'm going to have to think about exactly what they're saying a little bit more, because I know that we're planning to a 22% reserve margin target. And if you planned DEC separate from DEP, one of them requires a 24% reserve margin target. The other one requires a 21%, and they settled on 22, which I thought was reasonable. And that seems to be giving savings of reserve margin already. So I have to think through that issue further. I'm not 100% clear because I thought we were already getting benefits of a lower reserve margin target as it is.
All right, I appreciate that. Is there anything that you would suggest to us about these topics that we've just been talking about that we should address in this proceeding?
Oh my gosh, I think seeing that this is the 7th day of the proceeding, and I know that I've certainly attempted to speak to you about certain talking points that I wanted to get across, just like Duke took every opportunity to do as well. I can't really think of another topic that I haven't, though that isn't to say I don't have notes, but I think I've covered what, I mean, certainly maybe and I've already spoken to the point of conducting RFPs. ORS has put forth the notion that other utilities across the country have found that RFPs are a valuable means of finding the lowest cost resources. Even in your neighboring utilities, they have to go through it. Georgia Power goes through it regularly, and even it's identified gas-fired resources that they've acquired. It's possibly true that the merchant market doesn't exist today as it did in the past, but if it were known that Duke was doing a competitive RFP, it could in the future lead to merchants becoming interested and seeing them participate in the interconnection process and identify sites and bid. It's possible, but you don't know that without conducting the RFP.
All right, thank you. I appreciate your input. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Commissioner.
You've given us a lot of information. I appreciate all that. I sort of want to drill down and get to a place where I can use all your information to help me make a decision. You are very knowledgeable. I think you're an expert in the information that you are testifying to, and I understand that your ORS is expert, and I'm sure you have some level of contract with them, and they hired you to perform a specific job. But at this point, you're on the stand providing testimony under oath, and I really want to tie you down to a recommendation, understanding that it's up to the commission and that we have many factors to consider, but based on your expert experience and what you reviewed in this case, what is your recommendation to the commission regarding the most reasonable and prudent plan or even portfolio, depending on your perspective on that?
I could probably take the next. I'm sorry, Commissioner. I could probably take the next 5 minutes and attempt to avoid answering that.
You've been doing that you're pretty good at that. No disrespect, I appreciate it.
But I'll try to answer very quickly that I think you've got in front of you Clean Air Act cases that are telling you that delaying beyond 2035 on meeting, a 70% CO2 target is not absolutely necessary, not critical, and it buys additional time. And so if I absolutely had to be pinned down, which I prefer not to be, I'd prefer that to be for ORS to be pinned down to, I'd be looking to the Clean Air Act cases. We just don't think that we think that, we'd like to see additional risk analysis, bill impacts of those before making a final commitment. And we'd like to see also, a plan that meets the federal requirement, just strictly the federal requirement. We don't know why that wouldn't be what, you commissioners would want to see. So I hope you'll allow me to allow, witness Salter to be able to be pinned down on what ORS feels. But if I had to give you an answer to your question and not be evasive, I'm telling you, I think that essentially the 2038 case is the case that appears to me to be the most reasonable, but it's not based on a full evaluation of the case. We didn't get the full information.
Understand it, and thank you for that. I really appreciate it. That helps move this along. How long would it take to get? And I know you don't know by day, hour, and minute, but based on your experience, how long would it take to complete the analysis you think is appropriate to get all the information necessary to make a decision?
I think the company could probably do it. We're just talking about months. We're not talking about another year, another 6 months. We're talking about 1-2 months to provide additional information.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate you. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Any further commissioner questions? Any redirect?
No redirect.
Thank you very much. We've been going now for about 2 hours. Let's take about a 10-minute break, come back at 4:30. We are back in the hearing on Duke Energy's IRP submission in South Carolina, Integrated Resource Plan. We are now in the rebuttal stage testimony of the Office of Regulatory Staff. If you would, just like your witness is ready and eager to go.
Chair
I've
Pop.
been excused.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that. Can Mr. Hayek be excused?
Oh, yes, certainly.
Thank you.
Let me add, all commissioners are in the courtroom and all parties are here or virtual.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. ORS calls Mr. Finley Salter. Good afternoon, Mr. Salter. Could you please state your name for the record? That helps.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Salter, could you please state your name for the record?
James Finley Salter.
And are you the same Finley Salter that appeared during the direct phase of this case?
Yes, I am.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 22 pages of pre-filed rebuttal testimony filed in these dockets on August 30th, 2024?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes, edits, or corrections to your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today as those posed in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Mr. Salter be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Chair, as before, I need to raise a contemporaneous objection given ORS's hanging objection to our expert testimony previously entered into the record, given that Mr. Salter's rebuttal testimony includes some legal conclusions and policy thoughts. And I can give you those page numbers and line numbers if you please.
Well, why don't can you get that together on paper? I mean, do you have those?
Yes, sir. It's page 7, line 15 through page 18, line 6 of his rebuttal testimony.
Repeat that, please.
Yes, sir. Page 7, line 15 through page 18, line 6.
All right. As we have for other objections to testimony being struck, I will take that under advisement, but will not rule on that at this time.
Thank you, sir.
Therefore, the pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salter, did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you give that at this time?
Good afternoon, Chair Powers, Vice Chair Williams, and members of the Commission. My rebuttal testimony summarizes the status of ORS recommendations based on review of the company's responses and rebuttal testimony. For purposes of this proceeding, ORS considers 13 of the recommendations resolved and identified 6 recommendations that remain unresolved with the companies. The 6 unresolved recommendations associated with renewable energy modeling, resource retirements, portfolio analysis, new resources, and benchmarking were discussed in greater detail by witness Hayat and Welburn. Company witness Roberts addressed ORS recommendation G2 regarding transmission investments and rebuttal testimony, and ORS is satisfied with the reporting limited to comprehensive IRPs. I discuss additional information and modeling results provided in rebuttal testimony by company witness Quinto, the results of which demonstrate there are multiple portfolios which delay the interim 70% carbon emissions reduction target beyond 2035, which are lower cost than the company's preferred portfolio, while complying with applicable state and federal environmental regulations, including those of North Carolina in the EPA's Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule. These results confirm there are other feasible portfolios which balance consumer affordability, commodity price risk, and diversity of generation supply more appropriately than Duke Energy's preferred portfolio, while complying with state and federal environmental regulations and maintaining reliability in accordance with South Carolina Code annotated section 583740C2. ORS continues to request the company model an optimal resource plan to address carbon risk while not limiting resources to meet infeasible mass-based compliance targets proposed by the company to aggressively comply with North Carolina law. As such, in surrebuttal, ORS revised unresolved recommendation F5, requesting the companies be required to produce and provide a resource plan developed strictly to comply with Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule requirements without an interim 70% carbon emissions reduction constraint. This portfolio should be fairly evaluated using the mini-max regret analysis framework for performance under CO2 price, fuel price, and capital cost sensitivities. In my surrebuttal testimony, I point out that in South Carolina, the IRP acts as a guide, not a mandate, allowing the companies, interested parties, and the commission necessary flexibility should future conditions impact resource planning. I clarify that ORS's concern lies in the company's repeated request for the commission to affirm that specific actions the companies are undertaking in the near term are prudent and consistent with the public interest. I also respond to company witness Shirley Smith's request for commission guidance regarding the NTAP and discuss several consequences that could impact customers as a result of the commission's approval of the company's unique request. These consequences include that the companies may later argue that they are entitled to recover certain unknown and not yet incurred expenses from South Carolina customers on the basis of commission affirmation and direction for the companies to pursue the implementation of the NTAP as being in the public interest. Also, by the company's request for the commission to manage the decision-making of the companies through the request to affirm the acquisition, construction, and development of specific resources, it appears the companies seek to foreclose scrutiny on their resource decision, of which expenses are not yet known and not yet incurred. Finally, ORS and other parties' ability to review and challenge the company's final decisions in future procurement, citing, and rate proceedings could be diminished or precluded if the companies are successful in their request. I reaffirm ORS's recommendation that the Commission should preserve its full authority and obligation to review and affirm the prudence of decisions made by the companies and to determine the public interest on acquisition or construction of generation resources and applicable rate proceedings. Finally, I respond to company witness Bateman's rebuttal testimony regarding development of an alternative rate-making framework between North Carolina and South Carolina jurisdictions. I recommend the Commission reject such a proposal as rate-making and cost allocation determinations are made in the appropriate rate proceedings, and this discussion is outside the scope of the IRP proceeding. I also recommend the Commission reject Duke Energy's broader attempt to secure cost allocation and rate-making commitments for the resources that have not been acquired, constructed, or placed into service. This concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Salter. Mr. Chair, Mr. Salter is available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Torrey. Duke Energy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Salter.
Good afternoon.
Sam Wellborn on behalf of the companies. On the radial distribution planning projects that we've been talking about throughout the course of this hearing, on redirect, do you recall your exchange with Commissioner Belzer about why ORS asked to include those projects in this proceeding?
For transparency.
And I watched that part back over again with the online videos. What I had recorded from your response was that ORS believed that a comprehensive list of those investments would be helpful. Do you recall that?
That sounds familiar.
You're aware that IRP statute doesn't require a comprehensive list. It actually requires an inclusion of a, quote, summary of the electrical transmission investments that are planned by the utility.
Well, our interpretation of that statement is that that a list would meet the requirements of the summary.
Yes, sir. So let's say you had a book report due, and the teacher asked you to summarize the book. You wouldn't hand her the book, right? You would give her something shorter than everything.
That I guess I haven't been in school in a while, so
That's fair. But the fact of the matter is there is a distinction or a difference between what you would call a comprehensive list and a summary of things, right?
Our recommendation was to include those lines based on the company's definition that those lines are classified as transmission.
Would you agree that the company's provided even more information about their transmission projects in this IRP as compared to the 2020 IRP?
Yes, they did. I wasn't involved in the 2020 IRP, but from what I recall from reviewing past reports, there was a recommendation at that time for the company to include a list of transmission projects then.
And if it was compliant in that last comprehensive IRP proceeding, it's even more compliant this time around. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I'm not familiar whether it was compliant or not. I wasn't involved in that proceeding.
So you don't recall whether this was an issue in the last IRP proceeding? You didn't review the company's 2020 comprehensive IRP or the order that followed?
I've reviewed it, but I just don't recall whether that was specifically called out as a compliance issue.
That's fair. And you're aware that in this proceeding, there are entities that are interested in these distribution planning projects, aren't you?
That's correct.
And those projects are already in the evidentiary record in this proceeding, right?
Well, we included a list of projects in our report on a confidential basis based on responses from the company in discovery.
Yes, sir. So they're in the record. But out of good faith and transparency, would you agree that the companies agreed to include them in future IRPs? Kind of to your point about increasing or enhancing the transparency around these projects, the companies agreed to include those moving forward?
Yes, and in my rebuttal testimony, we actually compromised with the company and agreed that comprehensive IRPs, it was reasonable that the company would only include that full listing in a comprehensive IRP.
Thank you, sir. We'll switch topics a little bit. ORS had 19 recommendations. I think you mentioned that in your testimony summary for the companies in y'all's direct testimony. Is that right? I counted 19. Trust but verify.
Yeah, subject to check.
Okay. And in our rebuttal testimony, and you mentioned this, I think, in your summary as well, that the companies were able to resolve most of those, many of those recommendations from ORS.
Yes, we consider 13 of those recommendations resolved.
And some of those recommendations included the companies discussing certain matters and stakeholder engagement. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you're aware that the companies hosted stakeholder engagement ahead of preparing and filing the IRP in this proceeding. Wouldn't you agree?
That's correct.
And I'm going to put on screen Appendix A. This is page 13 of Appendix A. Try to zoom in here to make sure you can see it. All right. So, and I'm just going to point out a couple things. You tell me if I'm reading them right or not. So, there was a request, for example, that the companies evaluate plan sensitivities around the EPA rule, the proposed rule at that time. It was a proposed rule. Do you see that?
Model scenarios around proposed EPA Rule 111.
Yes, sir. And there was a recommendation that the companies run portfolios with later SMR availability. You see that right
I see
here? There's one over here. Feedback received via Q&A, feature chat, and dedicated email address. So we had different mechanisms for receiving feedback from stakeholder participants. Does that look right?
That looks right.
So that appears to be a constructive process, right? The companies hosted various forums and was able to receive feedback from stakeholders and then incorporate that feedback into the IRP?
Yes, ORS finds the stakeholder process very valuable, and it's helpful in narrowing the issues that the commission needs to consider in
Thank
a case
you.
like this.
Yes, sir. And by doing that, it could lead to a better or an improved resource plan for the commission's consideration. You agree with that?
Sure, yeah.
And would you agree that for that process to be effective or to be helpful to the commission, stakeholder participants need to be able to provide feedback, opinions, and recommendations? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And I think I agree with you, and I think the commission agrees with both of us. This is from the Dominion order from this past year issued in January, the amended order. This is ordering paragraph 3 that the company shall continue, the company there being Dominion, continue to utilize the stakeholder working group and shall continue to allow parties to the stakeholder proceedings reasonable opportunities to raise issues that the parties believe are material to future IRPs and IRP updates. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
So it sounds like we're all on the same page there. ORS agrees, the companies agree, and the commission agrees that stakeholder engagement is a good thing. You agree that we can work through new recommendations and other modeling ideas that may pop up through the stakeholder process and as part of that engagement process?
As ORS designs and crafts its recommendations, I mean, we're very discerning as to what recommendations are appropriate for the stakeholder committee in that what recommendations are sort of further out in time could maybe benefit from receiving more informal input from other parties, and which recommendations we feel are more should be addressed in a more immediate time frame or more near term.
I might need your help kind of parsing that statement. So y'all hold on to certain recommendations and you go ahead and make certain recommendations, or help me just better understand what.
So if you look at my testimony, either my direct or my surrebuttal, what I'm referring to is the table where we make recommendations and we recommend future IRP 2023 IRP. Many of the future IRP recommendations in the body of the recommendation, it sort of discusses that this should be taken up in the stakeholder working group. That's what I'm referring to.
I see. But if we're between IRPs, everything is future IRP, right? So if we rewind, for example, back to February 2023, when we began our stakeholder engagement and held a series of 5 sessions with our stakeholders to solicit, receive, and incorporate feedback as we prepared the IRP, all the recommendations from that point, presumably, are going to be or should be considered at least for the next comprehensive IRP. Would you agree with that?
You mean recommendations that are made in the stakeholder working group?
Yes, sir.
I suspect so.
Okay. Thank you. And you're aware that the EPA regulations were finalized April 2024. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, it's either late April or early May in my mind, but yeah, subject to check.
April 6th is the date I have in my mind. I'm looking to see if my co-accountant, no, I've got shaking heads, sometime in April. All right. And that was 3 months prior to ORS filing its direct testimony on July 1st. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we've established, it sounded like Mr. Hayat said that he had the capability to run different modeling scenarios, and that he did in fact run different modeling scenarios. Is there a reason why ORS didn't model the EPA rules when they came out?
Generally, that wasn't part of our review. If I think back to the May time frame, we were really in the depth of detailed analysis of the supplemental IRP. And frankly, we spent a lot of time in this review comparing what was in the initial IRP to what was in the supplemental filing. So that took a lot of bandwidth there. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, we didn't ask Jay Kennedy to perform any analysis of the Clean Air Act modeling, and our recommendation in this case was for the we acknowledged that the rule was fairly new and from our perspective still pretty fresh even when we filed our direct testimony, and that was why, going back to your earlier question, our recommendation said in the next IRP update, because we thought it was, that was a reasonable time frame for the companies to consider the implications.
So, but the EPA had a proposed rule that had been pending for some time, right?
That's correct.
And then they finalized that rule in April of 2024, 3 months ahead of ORS filing its direct testimony.
Yes, and there was changes between the proposed and the final.
That's right. And your testimony is that essentially the EPA final rules were not material enough to warrant ORS allocating resources to that. Is that right?
No, what I'm saying is that, time and resources of the ORS were committed to reviewing the IRP as filed.
But now ORS's recommendation, isn't it, to run additional EPA 111 modeling, even though it wasn't material to ORS at that time?
Well, it was material, but it was more of the time frame. Our recommendation was that the company consider it in the IRP update, and rebuttal, witness Quinto actually went ahead and provided a suite of modeling on the Clean Air Act in rebuttal, and that was new information to us when we got the rebuttal testimony, and that was material information to us. So that was what, if you're asking about the revised recommendation in surrebuttal, that's what drove the revised recommendation in the witness Quinto's additional modeling, some of those what I'll call sort of initial results that we saw from those sensitivities, and the pushback from witness Snyder and witness Smith as to why the company was not receptive to perform the modeling that was recommended in F5 to begin with in our direct testimony.
But you're aware that the companies included various EPA sensitivity analyses in their original IRP filing, are you?
I'm aware. I believe it was based on the proposed rule.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. We'll switch topics a little bit. So last week during the presentation of your direct testimony, Vice Chair Williams had some questions and said in the middle of those questions that it didn't sound like there was much disagreement between the ORS and the companies. Do you remember that?
I don't know if I remember that directly, but I think I've heard that said a couple of times by different parties in this case.
Yes, sir. And this is another video that I had the pleasure of watching back over the weekend. And then Vice Chair Williams asked what had changed since the last IRP proceeding, and you said that the company's near-term action plan had more details and specificity than other near-term action plans that ORS had reviewed in the past. Do you remember that?
I thought, details and specificities, I think I qualified that with that is not necessarily an issue, and it was the magnitude and the amount of resources was also different.
That's right. You said it was 2 pages long, so it seemed like kind of a lot. I mean, just to paraphrase, that's not a direct quote, obviously.
Yeah, maybe we were talking about a shopping list at one point.
You were talking about a shopping list.
Yeah, okay.
And in the last 2020 comprehensive IRP proceeding, I'm going to put this on screen. I believe I may have made copies of these just for the commission's awareness. This won't be a hearing exhibit, but just for ease of reference. You remember Mr. Santanato? We talked about him last time, correct?
Good guy.
Yeah, I agree. Recommendation number 24, ORS had recommended that the companies, Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, provide additional details and status updates about resources included in the action plan. There by action plan, is he referring to the short-term or the near-term action plan?
That's correct.
Yeah, so in the last IRP proceeding, ORS had recommended that we include more detail this time around in the IRP. Is that correct?
That's what I'm reading here.
And so now there's maybe some nervousness about the companies providing more detail in their action plan.
If you give me a second, I tried to sort of make this clear. and I may just have to paraphrase it. I thought it was in somewhere in my testimony, but I was aware of the recommendation. And we do believe a detailed short-term action plan is the best practice in IRPs. And somewhere in my testimony, I try to make clear that it's not the detail of the action plan that gives ORS pause. It's the repeated request in testimony that accompanies this filing for the affirmation of the commission to provide guidance that these are good first steps and other types of statements that these resources are in the public interest, that we wanted to ensure that we bring awareness to in this testimony.
Thank you. And I think we've had a chance to clarify and walk through some of that with some of the company's testimony. You don't disagree that the companies are regulated utilities, do you?
I don't disagree.
Another thing that, and tell me if you remember this or not, Vice Chair Williams said that he prefers direct and consistent communication, at least for his part.
Yes, I agree. Vice Chair Williams appreciates direct and consistent communication.
And the company shouldn't be hiding the ball on what it plans to do or proposes to do to meet the challenge of growing load set before it, should it?
I do not believe the company should be hiding the ball.
And that's the whole point of this proceeding, right? Put information before the commission, help us get our resource plans evaluated so that we can go and meet load.
So, and at the end of that, the commission determines what the most reasonable and prudent plan is.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Prior to this proceeding, ORS had a modeling recommendation. They filed comments in December 30th, 2022. Do you remember that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. Do you remember that ORS had a modeling recommendation in comments that it filed in the previous IRP dockets on December 30th, 2022? And I can hand this to you if that's a little easier.
I don't recall. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'll just quick put this on screen, but
is this comments regarding the company's IRP update?
It was in the IRP update, but it was as relevant to the companies, and you'll see that the highlight there. In light of the above, there's reference to what the companies should include in their 2023 comprehensive IRPs.
Okay.
And ORS recommendation number 3 for our 2023 comprehensive IRPs, the ones we're currently litigating before this commission, is that the company should include a portfolio that's optimized utilizing the economic coal retirement dates developed without carbon taxes that does not include any carbon dioxide reduction constraints. Did I read that right?
Yes.
And so that was the ORS recommendation for this proceeding, that the companies include a no carbon constraints portfolio, which we've called P0. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then in your direct testimony, ORS had a new modeling recommendation, and that was that we use a carbon price to drive our modeling. Is that correct?
So to sort of back up a little bit, the companies, in an attempt to comply with what ended up being in the commission order that aligned with this recommendation, produced a sensitivity analysis. In our view, a portfolio with a capital P here is consistent with sort of what the company considered when it looked at its quote unquote core portfolios, P1, P2, P3, in that we would have expected not just a side sensitivity performed, but a full sort of analysis comparing this portfolio to the other portfolios, and with a mini-max regret analysis and bill impacts calculated associated with that portfolio, so that you could understand the full risk profile of this portfolio, not just here's a portfolio, here's what it looks like, isn't it interesting? So we did have discussions with the company about this at the beginning of the year, and I try to lay this out a little bit in my surrebuttal testimony, and I'm not going to go like blow by blow, but where we ended up is we requested in discovery to actually get the Minimax portfolio. I think it ended up at the beginning of the year. The company was tied up in trying to get the supplemental analysis out the door and complete. And once that was completed, I think there was enough resources to then go in and actually produce the Minimax regret analysis that the ORS believed was appropriate to adequately evaluate P0 on the same level playing field as P1, P2, P3. Went back and forth, and it was late April, early May time frame before we actually received all the data that we believe necessary to validate that Minimax analysis. And so at that point, that's when we were actually able to perform a full review of P0.
So let's track back a little bit. ORS had a recommendation for modeling in December of 2022 for this proceeding, which was the no carbon constraints modeling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you had a new modeling recommendation in your direct testimony filed in this proceeding in July of this year. Is that correct?
It was included in the exhibit to my testimony. It was also discussed in witness Hayat's testimony.
And then in surrebuttal, ORS had another new modeling recommendation. Is that right?
Right. So let's talk about then, we determined based on the results of the Minimax, which in May we've got the sort of full view of what the risk profile of the Minimax regret analysis looked like, which in our report, we produced on page 111 in table 39. And so these results in this table is what led us to say, okay, the company did comply with the P0 recommendation. We now have the Minimax to evaluate that portfolio on a level playing field with the other portfolios and the company's preferred portfolio. And we see that P0 is not appropriately risk adjusted to take into account carbon risk. And that is what led us to craft our recommendation in F5.
So you crafted that recommendation after making two previous modeling recommendations. I guess, Mr. Salter, what I'm concerned about, frankly, now there's a question in this, is ORS has made 3 subsequent iterative modeling recommendations. What if the company's produced this new modeling and ORS has a new recommendation? How many times do you anticipate us going through these cycles?
I don't anticipate sort of, I couldn't speculate on that. I don't anticipate, just cycling and cycling, but just in general, the IRP is iterative. The ORS made a recommendation in the IRP update. We made a recommendation in this IRP.
Were you here?
But the ORS makes recommendations to all utilities that it reviews their IRPs, and we discuss them, and generally there tends to be agreement to accommodate those recommendations.
Did you hear Mr. Hyatt's testimony earlier today that he did run modeling on behalf of ORS?
Yes.
And ORS didn't file that modeling with the commission or provide it to the other parties, did they?
I think what Mr. Hyatt may have been referring to is some scratch modeling that consultants may perform on the side to help sort of think about the model. Consultants sort of live in the model. We never requested any specific modeling or any alternative portfolio that we would include in our report. But generally, our concern was that we're looking at P0. we're looking at P3 and we're just scratching our head and saying, isn't there another portfolio that could be in between those two portfolios and be more reasonable for customers?
But you're not willing to speculate what ORS's reaction would be when it gets this new modeling. If maybe there would be yet another recommendation for new modeling and we would go on from there. It's too early to say.
I mean, I'm not following the speculative. I don't follow the speculative question.
Oh, that was your word. I believe you said you couldn't speculate as to what ORS's reaction to the new modeling would be, or whether there would be a subsequent recommendation for subsequent modeling.
I mean, I'm not going to foreclose on the ORS making recommendations to the company in the future. No, I'm not going to foreclose on ORS making recommendations to the company.
Okay. You agree, though, that there's been substantial economic development in the Carolinas. You've been hearing that. You saw that in the IRP. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Did you hear Secretary of Commerce Harry Lightsey testify before the Senate Special Committee last week?
No, I'm afraid I did not.
No, you were busy. So you didn't hear him testify about the need for new generation to support economic development load in the Carolinas, did you?
No, sir.
But you would agree that we can't just keep spinning our wheels on new modeling. We have to get moving on new generation?
Spinning our wheels. I believe that the time taken in this proceeding and the time that ORS and the other interveners took to review Duke's plan, and frankly, the time that Duke has put into its plan and the analysis and the breadth of the plan. You mentioned the plan from back in 2020. I mean, I think all that time in planning is time well spent, because the resources that we're talking about are capital intensive resources that will have implications for, frankly, generations to come. So I do think it's important to put the appropriate level of analysis and discernment into identifying not only the resources, but the timing to develop and deploy those resources.
But you've heard, haven't you, for example, the next near-term action plan for offshore wind is an acquisition RFI, so we can get more information about that resource. So we're not building offshore wind tomorrow. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree. The near-term action plan includes the ARFI.
Thank you, sir. We'll switch gears a little bit. SMRs. So Counsel for ORS asked Mr. Steve Capps last week about the company's early site permit related to SMRs. You were here for that, weren't you?
Yes, sir, I was.
And ORS's counsel's questions focused on whether the company should be pursuing an early site permit. Did you hear that?
Yes.
Did you review Appendix J to the company's IRP?
Yes, I did.
And so you reviewed the information in that appendix that discussed the benefits of pursuing an early site permit?
I couldn't recount them off the top of my head, but I'm aware that the company believes that there's benefits to pursuing the early site permit.
I'll help you out. I won't leave you hanging. So one of the benefits, and you tell me if this stands to reason or not based on your policy background and history, whether an early site permit can reduce the risk of delay during construction from siting or environmental issues. If you don't know, that's fine. I'm not trying to trap you.
I think even as acknowledged in the company's Appendix J, there are multiple pathways to NRC certification of the site. And there's multiple pathways to receive either a separate construction and operating license or a combined operating license. I think certifying the site is one step. I think another way you could reduce risk is to wait until there's a design certification and pursue development activities once you have an NRC approved design certification in hand. And I think there's some discussion about those two paths and maybe some trade-offs in Appendix J. So sufficient to say there's more than one path.
So, but you heard Mr. Capps testify about getting the parcel ready while we wait, as you put it, for those designs to complete. In other words,
Getting the parcel ready,
Yeah,
doing
so
the
he-
geotechnical investigations and site characterization work.
That's right. So he talked about a land envelope, right, or a parcel envelope as relevant to the early site permitting process. Do you remember him speaking to those matters?
Yes.
And he essentially said that while we wait, your words, for the technologies to complete the design phase, that we can prepare the site. Do you remember him saying that?
Yes, and I believe the company has characterized done site characterization work at other sites in the past as well too.
Yes, sir. And if ORS doesn't think pursuing, for example, an early site permit is in the public interest, wouldn't it make sense for that position to be made clear in final testimony?
Objection. Mr.
State your
Welburn.
objection, please.
Yes, Mr. Welburn is asking about he's asking legal conclusion, something that asks for a legal conclusion.
Mr. Chair, I'm just asking ORS's sole internal witness what his position is on pursuing this particular activity.
That doesn't sound like a legal question, but if you're asking legal questions after making a motion to strike his testimony because it's a legal conclusion, that's just kind of hard to swallow.
I'll rephrase it and see if it strikes counsel a little bit better.
Let's try that.
Yes, sir. Mr. Salter, do you think the company should pursue an early site permit?
As part of our review, we didn't necessarily review the near-term action plan specifically. I mean, we reviewed the IRP plan in totality and did not review specific resources or specific actions to determine prudence of those specific activities. Those will be reviewed at a later date.
Your testimony is that ORS did not review the company's proposed near-term actions.
Well, we reviewed that the company had near-term actions. We determined that they generally aligned with the preferred portfolio. The sort of conundrum here is you've got a preferred portfolio from the company. The commission is going to determine what's the most reasonable and prudent plan. Depending on what the most reasonable and prudent plan is, as determined by the commission, could then dictate the details of the specific near-term actions. So, reviewed the near-term actions, looked at them and said, well, those are consistent with what the company's putting forward, but we're not going to necessarily take the next step and review and take specific objection to actions in the near-term action plan.
All right. On screen, Mr. Salter, is Executive Order 2023-18, appears to have been issued June of 2023, and that was after you started at ORS, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Chair, I'm not going to tender this as a hearing exhibit. I'm just putting it on screen and handing it out for ease of reference as a demonstrative. Mr. Salter, I'm going to just read that first paragraph. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, don't worry, but that first paragraph, you tell me if I've read it right. The state of South Carolina has significant interests in ensuring the safety, security, efficiency, affordability, reliability, resiliency, and sustainability of the state's energy resources, as well as enhancing and diversifying South Carolina's power production capacity. Did I read that right?
Yes, you did.
Thank you. And we talked, I believe Mr. Breitschwert asked Mr. Hyatt about Santee Cooper's 2024 IRP update. Were you aware that was filed last week?
Yes, I was aware about that.
There's no rest for the weary. I think I'm going to get these handed out as well. Again, just as a demonstrative and ease of reference. And Santee Cooper's IRP, it's an IRP update, pardon me. And this is so let's start square one. Santee Cooper's the state-owned, South Carolina state-owned utility.
That's correct.
And this is their IRP update, the 2023 preferred portfolio reoptimized. I'm looking over in this column, the third column. You see that?
The 2023 preferred portfolio reoptimized. Okay.
Yes, sir, in that third column. So there's a couple of interesting things in there that I think are similar to what Duke Energy is doing, and you tell me if you agree.
Objection, Mr. Chair. Council's testifying.
Mr. Salter, I'll defer to you, Mr. G. I've got a question for him. Don't worry. Were you aware that in Santee Cooper's IRP update filed last week, they have 600 megawatts of wind?
Okay, so I do agree that there is wind in the plan. What we're looking at here is the 2023 preferred portfolio reoptimized. When I was looking at Santee Cooper's, I mean, this may be right, but there was a couple of tables in there. So as I don't want to commit that 600 megawatts is the actual final quantity of onshore wind. I saw a couple different variations of that in there, but I would agree that there's onshore wind in the portfolio. Mm-hmm. What I also noted is that this onshore wind was priced based on a power purchase agreement. Was something else that I noted in my quick review.
And I'm not asking you to parse their IRP update, which was just filed. I shouldn't put you on the spot like that. But the fact of the matter is they do have a fair amount of wind in there, a fair amount of new solar batteries. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think the conclusion of this IRP update is that visibility is uncertain as to the future of onshore wind in South Carolina because no onshore wind has been sited in South Carolina yet, and sort of they were going to investigate in future IRPs. I think was sort of where it ended. They didn't really have a short-term action plan for the update, but that was sort of the conclusion.
But it's in there, right? And
it's
that's the state-owned utility. Okay, thank you. So Duke Energy we're not all by ourselves in terms of retiring coal and adding new renewables to the system. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
And we're retiring coal just like other utilities in South Carolina. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
One example, I think of Roxborough 4, I think it has a 14% capacity factor. Does that sound roughly right? Or if you don't know, that's fine. But
I don't know off the top of my head. That's something that Mr. Hayat may have been better able to address.
Fair enough. We won't call him back up for that. But you're aware that we're planning to replace that old coal resource that runs at 14% capacity factor with a new combined cycle resource?
That sounds correct.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Davis for CCBA, whose testimony I don't appear to have with me, but you remember there was a table in his testimony that showed substantial solar batteries retiring coal for Dominion. Do you remember that?
I was focused on the company's testimony. I didn't look super close at Mr. Davis' testimony.
That's fine. Let's just do one quick thought exercise and suspend any reservations you may have about the company's IRP. Could it ever be true that the company's IRP complies both with our regulatory requirements in North Carolina and be the most reasonable and prudent plan for South Carolina customers?
Well, I mean, I think it could. And frankly, that is what drove our initial recommendation F5 and our subsequent revision to recommendation F5. In looking at the company's portfolio, the trajectory of carbon reductions, the trajectory of solar additions, like in figure 10A in my report on page 71, page 72, I mean, these are the kind of data points that we're looking at, and there's just a lot of daylight between P3 base and P0. So when we're reviewing the IRP, thinking about our report, thinking about the public interest in South Carolina that does not have an interim carbon constraint requirement, we attempted to craft that recommendation in a way that was consistent with the way that other utilities in South Carolina, including the Duke companies, have captured the cost or the risk of carbon in past IRPs in the hopes that if the company could produce that, I mean, that could help provide a different lens for the commission and for the ORS on the balancing factors, and that, that there could maybe be less daylight between the plans, and that would show maybe a more reasonable trajectory for carbon reductions and resource additions.
Thank you, Mr. Salter. Mr. Chair, no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Welborn. All right, there we go to Sierra Club.
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Say CCL.
No questions.
Sasiba.
No questions, but thank you.
Walmart.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Mr. Salter, almost good evening. You have had the benefit of listening to most of this, and I recognize that there's testimony that you filed at various dates prior. Does ORS have any new recommendations?
No, ma'am.
And from ORS's perspective, does the benefit of going to 22% for the reserve margin from 17% outweigh the cost?
We've not done a cost benefit analysis or a cost analysis of it. We acknowledge that and understand that there's a cost to increasing reliability or increasing the reserve margin. And I believe sort of you referenced that recommendation. That's one reason why we sort of reviewed the company's response to our initial recommendation in direct and determined in rebuttal that was resolved with clarification. I mean, we understand that the company is going to need to step into that high reserve margin, and it is a challenge because of the size of the company as well, or the size of the fleet. We resolved with clarification because we still believe that there's other avenues available to the company to attempt to acquire additional energy and capacity in the near term through an RFP, and that we believe the company should investigate that further. But understand that there's cost as far as increasing the reserve margin, and the ORS, I think Witness Hayat committed in his testimony that we're just going to need to monitor this closely. A big factor here is going to be the actual materialization of economic development load to the system. And sort of another factor is going to be the company's coal retirement plans.
In your rebuttal, there is table 1. You don't need to go to it, but it has the various items, and then it identifies 2023 IRP or future IRP. When you say future IRPs on that chart, what do you mean? It's on page 3.
Yeah, I'm just sort of looking at I'm sorry, give me a second. I'm just looking at the content here. I think I'd have to sort of parse the details of each recommendation. But generally, future IRPs would mean either the 2025 IRP update or the 2026 comprehensive IRP, or both. And generally the details of that recommendation should be specific as to what point in time the recommendation is geared towards.
And is there generally accepted fact that there will not be a 2024 IRP update? Based on the timing of our decision and the law?
Well, I mean, I think there's one required by the law. I think in the past I've seen the company has requested relief, maybe when there was a modified IRP in the past, and that slipped into the IRP update. But at this point in time, I believe it's required by the law.
Okay. Did you hear Ms. Bateman's testimony about kind of the difference between the North Carolina and South Carolina IRPs?
Yes.
And the sameness of them. And really the question is the options that she laid out for any divergence in accepted plans. And do you share her opinion about some of the options for how the company would handle a divergence in if South Carolina selects a different plan than North Carolina?
What I heard Witness Bateman talking about was two different things. I mean, I heard her talking about the North Carolina CPIRP process, the South Carolina IRP, and then I heard her speak about cost allocation. Where I sort of was not quite following is at one point I was following where she was saying cost allocation, if there's a specific resource, the company could allocate cost of that resource to one jurisdiction or the other. But the jurisdiction that didn't have that resource, it would be backfilled with other the cost of other resources. And then what I heard her say, she kept going back to splitting the states. And that's where I sort of lost her about this splitting the state. It seemed like it was very surgical at one point, and then it was this broader split the state narrative. So I'm not sure I completely followed the testimony.
Okay. And do you think it would benefit ORS to have more frequent reports from the company about the projected load forecast?
I think our recommendation in this report is appropriate as far as the annual updates that come in.
Okay, and you don't need anything any more frequent than that?
I believe our recommendation is appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much. No further questions from me.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Any other commissioner questions? Hearing none, is any redirect?
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, Vice Chair, go ahead.
Hanging in there.
I can't even turn my microphone on. So what I would like to hear from you is a response to the question I asked your expert, Mr. Hayat, regarding the ORS's recommendation for the commission at this point. I mean, you're the last witness, right? I'm pretty sure.
That's correct.
Right. So based off everything that you've heard, and why I'm asking this, you sort of got my true, authentic personality in terms of being direct. You sort of pegged that right. I try to be a chameleon. to work with others, because everyone they don't work well under a direct communication environment. But I think you can. I think you do. Based on everything that you heard, does the company or does ORS have a recommendation, considering the fact that the company has a very strong position in terms of their belief in it? They've been very consistent with that. I'm just trying to make sure I understand where your office stands on this matter, based on where we are right now.
So, Commissioner, I don't want to put myself in the commission's shoes, but in this report and in our direct and surrebuttal testimony, we've attempted to give a perspective on our view of the balancing factors, on our view of compliance to past commission orders. We stand by our recommendation F5 as it was revised, and believe that is important information for the commission to have to make its determination. The company did provide a substantial amount of information as far as sensitivities go in Exhibit 1 to witness Quinto's testimony, but at the end of the day, those were sensitivities, and we believe the commission should have a full view of the risks associated with any portfolio that it approves.
Understood. Makes perfect sense. I'm trying to get a sense of the timing here. Is that reject the RRP, the IRP, conduct F5, accept the IRP, modify it, or let's strike modification, accept it, update with F5? Do you have a perspective there?
Well, I think in the past, the commission has opted to modify company's IRP in the past, but again, I don't want to put myself in the commission's shoes if it determined that it has enough information to determine based on the portfolios presented that one is the most that balances the factors appropriately. The annual update could be appropriate as well, but what I've heard from the company is an urgency associated with this proceeding. I'll leave it at that.
Right. And I agree. I've heard that, and that sort of gets into the next question I have for you. But I just want to make sure you understand what I'm asking you. So I have my own concerns, and I'm sure my colleagues have a long list of concerns that we're going to talk through as we work through getting to a decision. But I want to know what you think in terms of, in your shoes, representing the public interest. Do you think it's appropriate, or do you think the public interest is at risk if we were to accept this IRP and request your recommendations in the update? I'm trying to assess, I'm trying to get your perspective on the risk or the threat to the public interest so I can make a determination about the most reasonable and prudent IRP.
Sort of a little bit of, I've heard a lot in this proceeding about how much the companies can do in the IRP update, but that was in a little bit of contrast to what I read in pre-filed testimony as to what the companies were willing to actually do in an IRP update. So there's a little bit difference there, at least maybe I was misreading it. So I think it's important for the commission to have all the information it deems appropriate to make its determination. What we've seen in the near-term action plan is substantive amount of investment in the next 2 years. And if it ends up being that the IRP update or the next comprehensive IRP, this commission doesn't see sort of the full suite of reasonable portfolios that are available to it. I think a lot of it appears from the near-term action plan that a lot of activity would have occurred. And I think that, going back to council's questions to me, I think that is the benefit of the near-term action plan. The company is communicating to ORS and to the commission what it intends to do in the next 2 years. We disagree that the commission should affirm those actions, but we believe, and that is why we have recommended in the past that companies should include detailed actions in their near-term action plan to inform the commission, ORS, and other parties that, what are the outcomes of the plan that's being approved in this case.
I agree with you totally, and I'll make this statement. I think that the company demonstrated a level of transparency that caused concerns, at least from my perspective, especially transparency regarding potential costs. But I think we can put something to bed. Would you agree with me that the company, based on their testimony, is not seeking a pre-approval, a soft approval, or some level of affirmation of their plans or recovery of costs for the plans that they put forth in the short-term action plan? Not based on the pre-filed testimony, but the live testimony that you've heard along with the questioning from the commission and other parties through the course of this hearing. Can we put that item to bed?
Yes, I agree, and I just would, request that the commission take a hard look at my direct and surrebuttal testimony, and we have recommendations for the commission to sort of ensure that there's no ambiguity in that fact.
Understood, and thank you for bringing that to our attention. Believe me, we're paying attention to you. Putting that issue to bed, and it may be hard to answer this question based on everything you've heard, but knowing and understanding that the company is not asking for a pre-approval of cost recovery, knowing and understanding that the IRP statute does not allow the IRP to serve as or to be considered determinative. If that was established before this hearing, if that was established before your pre-filed testimony, would that change the way you felt about this IRP? All things being equal, if there was never what I would call a change in posture or a level of transparency in the short-term action plan to make you feel as if they were seeking a pre-approval, would you change the way you feel about the IRP? Because I feel like that took up a lot of air in this hearing.
Yeah, no, and I'd agree, and I appreciate that you say that, because to me, this IRP has been two big issues, right? It's been the pre-approval issue, and then it's been, actually looking at the plan, looking at the compliance, looking at balancing the factors, looking at the feasibility of the plan. To me, in sort of reviewing this plan and being a part of this process from the beginning, I think those are two issues. They may be connected in certain ways, but they're separate issues, I think, to be considered.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I believe that's all commissioner questions. Redirect.
No redirect, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. It's my understanding from my counsel that the parties wanted to make some sort of brief statement, closing statement. Is that true?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
If we do that now and the word brief is remembered, we should be finished today.
The companies would prefer to go last as the party with the burden of proof, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, but ORS is going to get that privilege. Unless they want to waive it. Mr. Torrey.
Be happy for the company to go ahead.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Well, I said we'd be happy for the company to go last.
Okay. Well, then we'll go down the list. Sierra Club, any closing statement?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Jaffe is available to make a closing statement.
All right. Ms. Jaffe?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you, Chairman Powers and Commissioners. My name is Dory Jaffe on behalf of the Sierra Club. And you've heard a lot of testimony over these past 7 days. And I think one thing seems pretty clear. Duke
Powers.
is heading in the right direction, and they need to stay on this path, albeit with some modifications. We are encouraged by the coal retirements and their increased levels of clean energy and battery storage, but they can and they should do better if they don't want to put
Ms.
all their
Jaffe,
eggs.
Ms. Jaffe,
Yes.
let me interrupt you a second. I think there's a question here on the floor.
Chair Powers, Ms. Jaffe, I apologize for the interruption, but we still have a witness on the stand. He hasn't been released.
Oh, okay. Mr. Salters, you're free to go.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Ms. Jaffe. If you would, it may be good to just start over. Since
Sure,
it's
no
brief.
problem. All right. So as I was saying, you've heard a lot of testimony over these past 7 days, and one thing to us does seem pretty clear, that Duke is heading in the right direction and that they need to stay on this path, albeit with some modifications. We are encouraged by their coal retirements and their increased levels of clean energy and battery storage, but they can and they should do better if they don't want to put all of their eggs in the gas resource basket, especially since, as you heard from company witness Snyder, there is exposure and risk to including high levels of gas resources in its portfolios, such as locking customers into 35 years of fuel price volatility, stricter federal rules, including upcoming rules on existing gas plants. And it's unfortunate that Duke doesn't apply these same gas risk concerns to its own preferred P3 fall portfolio. Turning to the company's analysis on the 111 rule, confirms the company's need to retire coal and the need to do so by the 2032 deadline to avoid substantial and significant retrofit costs. As evidenced by Exhibit 20, those dates are fairly consistent with P3 fall base. And while there has been a lot of discussion about the impacts of the North Carolina carbon reduction requirements on South Carolina, but what the commission really needs to focus on here is the 111 rule. This is a final rule, it must be complied with, and it should be the key driver in the timing of the coal retirements, not their replacement of gas, and irregardless of what the North Carolina law requires. As you heard through the testimony of multiple company witnesses and intervener witnesses, Rumpani and Davis, the national trend is moving away from coal. The entire industry is in decline. Access to parts, workforce, decline in coal mining, and rail transportation. All signs are pointing to the retirement of coal, and with the final 111 rule, Duke can't waste any time. The future is carbon-free, and as you heard from company witness Smith, when it comes to economic development, which is expanding in South Carolina, those customers want carbon-free resources to meet their own energy goals. And that is the future. It's not coal and it's not gas. Now, because a few of the coal plants are currently scheduled to retire after the 2032 111 rule deadline, the company does need to conduct some additional analysis to figure out what is in the best interest of its customers, specifically for Belews Creek and Roxborough 2 and 3. But they should also look at their high load forecast sensitivity, which could impact Marshalls 3 and 4 and Mayo if the company's retirement plans become delayed. And while some coal plants like Belews Creek are capable of co-firing, as you heard from company witness Snyder, it doesn't mean that co-firing is cost effective. Sierra Club would therefore ask that the company conduct this additional 111 analysis to determine what is the most cost-effective path moving forward. With respect to transmission, the Sierra Club 100% supports the Red Zone projects, and multi-value strategic transmission planning, both of which will help interconnect more renewables and are cost effective. However, as you heard from Mr. Goggin, more needs to be done since the red zone projects only meet 11% of the transmission needs identified by the Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative. Those additional projects need to be planned using the proactive process, and we encourage the Commission and Duke to make improvements to this process by including long-term high voltage expansion, planning and building stronger ties to neighboring balancing authorities, which will increase reliability and resilience while reducing Duke's reserve margin, and the use of short-term solutions like grid-enhancing technology and batteries. You also heard from company witness Meeks, who testified about the benefit of batteries as they relate to transmission, including such things as lowering costs to interconnect and the ability to defer transmission investments when a battery is a more cost-effective solution than a new transmission line. A flaw that the Sierra Club would like to see corrected, and as detailed in Mr. Goggin's testimony, Duke overstates the challenges associated with interconnecting renewables and then inappropriately relies on that as a basis to put arbitrary limits on their solar and storage build limits. Those limits need to be relaxed to ensure that renewables are getting a fair analysis in the modeling and to ensure the customers are not getting stuck with fuel price volatility and unnecessary risks of over-reliance on gas, concerns that even Duke has. Lastly, you heard about the consultant that Duke is hiring to draft a report on the cost and benefits of the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, a program that will provide up to $250 billion in low-cost loans to utilities as they transition to clean energy. Duke needs to do its customers a favor and apply for as much of that money as possible. So we would ask that the company be required to include South Carolina in their consultant review process and submit that final report to this commission so South Carolinians can also benefit from that program. The Sierra Club would therefore ask that you require Duke to modify its preferred plan to require an additional 111 analysis for the coal plants that don't retire by the 2032 deadline. We would ask for a relaxing of the solar and storage build limits, as well as the recommended improvements to the multi-value strategic transmission planning process as detailed by Mr. Goggin, along with the recommendations that were found in witnesses Duncan, Turk, and Rumpani as described in their direct testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffe. Say CCL.
Thank you, Chair Powers and members of the commission. If you could bear with me a little bit, I've been talking a lot less than a lot of people at this hearing, but I have somehow found myself losing my voice, so apologies for that. On behalf of Say CCL, Upstate Forever, and Vote Solar, wanted to first thank you for all of your time and attention over the last week and a half. There has certainly been a lot of very dense testimony to listen to and sort through, and there will definitely be a lot for you to think about as you work on your decision. I wanted to start by first highlighting 3 points of widespread agreement that you've heard from various parties over the last week and a half, all of which underscore significant directional consensus, not just here, but by utilities and other utilities in South Carolina and across the country around where our energy system is now and where it needs to go. First, coal is in decline. It's increasingly unreliable and expensive. Utilities can't get replacement parts to keep coal plants running. Coal supply is increasingly uncertain, and the whole industry is expected to further deteriorate as utilities across the country retire plants through the end of the decade. There is no reason to hold these plants to a different standard than any other old and inefficient resource. These units are not reliable, they're getting riskier by the day, and they have reached the end of their useful life. It's time to move on from the horse and buggy and focus on how to replace them. Second, there's agreement that solar and storage are consistently selected in the company's economic modeling, meaning that they will benefit ratepayers as soon as Duke can get them online. And there's no question that Duke can get those resources online faster than new gas. Third, there's agreement that a diverse portfolio is one of the surest ways to reduce risk to ratepayers. As fossil resources face increasing regulatory risks and price volatility, it just makes sense to plan how to transition to other resources moving forward. And we agree with Duke that it's appropriate to figure out how best to do that. Coal and gas will continue to expose ratepayers to fuel price spikes and reliability issues. Utilities have a newer and better set of tools in their tool belt, and so it's time to embrace the energy transition. It's happening now, it is inevitable, and turning a blind eye to the inevitable is exactly the type of bad planning that Act 62's IRP provisions are trying to prevent. Now, the areas where we disagree with Duke are where we feel that their plan fails to capitalize on known achievable steps to reduce ratepayer costs and risks. Solar and storage, both distributed and utility scale, are well established, well understood, and mature or maturing technologies with costs that are nearer term and easier to predict, particularly with additional savings coming in the form of federal tax incentives and credits. Every party in this case has testified about the risks of plans that are too reliant on resources with highly uncertain capital costs, regulatory risks, or untested technologies. And so it's time to be creative and figure out how to build more of these resources to hedge against those risks, particularly because the companies have a near-term capacity need that other resources can't fill because they take too long to build. A great example is a behind-the-meter storage program like the one proposed by Witness Turk. This type of program could cost-effectively add capacity in as little as 1 year, while also improving the resilience of Duke's system. Duke should be actively pursuing these resources in South Carolina and not just in North Carolina. Instead, the companies constrained some of these lower cost, more flexible resources from scaling quickly enough to meet high-low growth, resulting in a plan that, no matter how you look at it, has a lot of new gas. P3 is not immune from the immense reliability implications, volatility, and supply risks that the companies claim would result from the amount of gas in P0. P3's gas build-out results from a few different factors, and one of those is the company's choice to model its coal and gas units, the same units that failed customers during Winter Storm Elliott, with near-perfect firm capacity. Using an ELCC approach for these resources, like Duke used for renewables, would have better ensured that the model was accounting for weather, fuel, and other factors that affect those units' available capacity. By instead assuming that those units have perfect firm capacity, Duke's modeling essentially saw those units as more reliable than they actually are, and the model was therefore predisposed to keep coal and gas resources online or to build new gas. Their approach also overinflated the company's proposed reserve margin, causing the model to choose to build more of those very same resources that, again, failed in large numbers during Elliott. If you have a car model that's known to break down in the cold, buying 10 more of that same model of car is not a good plan to get you around in the winter. Duke's current approach will just increase costs for customers, and if not corrected, will continue to result in an unfair bias against clean energy resources. And so, recognizing that we have both areas of agreement and disagreement with the companies, I want to just end with a few targeted, attainable recommendations that would improve the company's plan now and in the future and put the companies and ratepayers in the best position for the planning period. First, for future IRPs, the Commission should direct the companies to evaluate the firm capacity of thermal resources in the same way as other supply-side alternatives are evaluated. Second, Duke should be required to more actively integrate distributed resources into its plan, both in their near-term action plan and in future IRPs. And third, as Ms. Jaffe also discussed, the Commission should encourage Duke to pursue higher levels of renewable interconnection under a more proactive transmission plan, consistent with Witness Goggins' testimony. Duke is moving in the right direction with transmission planning, but can do more to lower transmission and generation costs and interconnect more renewables. And it's not yet seizing those opportunities. Betting on more flexible, less expensive, and shorter lead time resources will allow the companies to truly check and adjust and adapt to the future. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and present our case, and we appreciate the Commission's consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Sasiba?
Mr. Burns has a closing.
Mr. Burns, glad to hear from you.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is John Burns on behalf of CCEBA. In this case, CCEBA has focused our attention on three key issues. The first is transmission planning reform. The second is the role of solar and storage in forming a portfolio that complies with South Carolina law, particularly Act 62. And then the third is the necessity of coal retirements, at least on the schedule that Duke has proposed. Like Ms. Jaffe, CCEBA, I would like to say that we are encouraged by the progress that the companies have made over the last several years in the development of their plans and portfolios and IRPs. This is a significantly better proposal in our view than those that were proposed even 2 years ago. The companies are making progress, and we'd like to acknowledge that at the outset. But we ask that in considering your order in this case, you give due consideration to the need for Duke to limit its exposure to price risk and resource risk, which Witness Haggerty shared was provided by increased solar and storage on the Duke grid, on the company's grid. We ask that you consider the need for the companies to engage and to continue to engage and to show you that they are engaging in proactive transmission planning reform. They've done some steps towards that, and the CTPC process is a very good first step, as Mr. Haggerty testified and Mr. Roberts testified. And it's important that as they go forward, their generation planning informs their transmission planning and vice versa. Mr. Haggerty and Mr. Goggins, I think, made clear in their testimony that while they have made great progress in getting to that level of proactive transmission planning reform, there is more that can be done, and that it is appropriate for this commission, along with its sister commission in North Carolina, to monitor that, request reports back on that, and to ensure that as they're presenting generation planning to you, they also take into account the proactive transmission planning that needs to be done. On that basis in transmission, CCEBA also supports the Red Zone 2.0 projects that were presented for your consideration. Finally, we ask that in considering the resource mix to be approved or to be authorized, you keep in mind that compliance with Act 62 is the key test. And as Mr. Davis testified, the retirement of coal and the addition of solar and storage set forth in P3 fall base is consistent with IRPs and procurements of peer utilities and other utilities subject to this commission's oversight. The most reasonable and prudent proposal will contain at least the level of solar and storage and other renewable resources consistent with that in P3 fall base. This will deploy least cost resources to the benefit of South Carolina ratepayers and will limit their exposure to gas price risk and shutter the increasingly expensive and unreliable coal plants. In that regard, please review the testimony of Mr. Haggerty, who not just before you in your questioning, but in his written testimony, talked about the need to avoid gas price risk in building a portfolio that complies with Act 62. ORS witness Hayat repeatedly referred to the costs. I think he referred to hundreds of millions in costs and lumped all resources together as he discussed the different portfolios in this case. What is clear, though, is that regardless of the portfolio, with the exception of P0, which does not comply with Act 62, the portfolios proposed and the other options discussed by other interveners all deploy significant amounts of solar and storage in the next several years. It's absolutely crucial to South Carolina ratepayer protection, to compliance with Act 62, and the authorization of the most reasonable and prudent IRP plan, that those levels of resources at least be accomplished. I ask that you carefully consider and recall the testimony of Mr. Davis and Mr. Haggerty in each of those issues, and I thank you very much for your attention and for your time over the past week. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Walmart, Ms. Eaton.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I think.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am. You go ahead.
Okay, great. We also appreciate the opportunity to participate in the proceedings and echo what everybody else has said about all of you commissioners listening carefully to the testimony for all these days. Walmart agrees that the development of the renewables is not just reasonable and prudent for the company to meet both federal and state laws, but it's also consistent with the sustainability and renewable goals of both its current customers, such as Walmart, and to attract and secure economic development for South Carolina. We appreciated very much the opportunity to present the testimony of Lisa Perry and your thoughtful questions to her. As you heard from her, she and Walmart supports the dual state planning. Obviously, that has efficiencies, and you've heard from many Duke witnesses on the efficiencies that kind of planning can achieve for the customers, which means lower rates for the customers. It's also true that many of you, I've heard through your questions and through some of the questioning by others of the Duke witnesses, that there is some concern with the cost of increasing the reserve margin to 22%. So while Walmart and Ms. Perry certainly support reliability perhaps more than the cost of electricity, surely that is something for the commission to consider when it's deciding which option to approve in this IRP. And then finally, we want to reiterate the importance of the stakeholder engagement among customers like Walmart, other commercial and industrial commercials, to explore customer-sited and potentially customer-funded generation, such as solar and storage or just independent storage, to help reduce Duke's electric load. The amount that Ms. Perry was testifying about, up to 600 megawatts, would actually be a meaningful amount to help Duke shrink the challenge. And so in addition to some of the proposals that the SACE witnesses made, we would ask that the commission consider supporting and encouraging this sort of stakeholder engagement to further explore the opportunities for the large customers to help shrink the challenge. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eaton. Mr. Torrey.
Ms. Rainey is going to provide the close, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Rainey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Throughout this hearing, Duke Energy has insisted that the companies are not seeking assurance of cost recovery in this case. Instead, Duke Energy asserts it is seeking a determination that resources contained in the company's near-term action plan are reasonable and prudent in the public interest and are consistent with South Carolina law and policy. South Carolina Code Section 583740 does not require this commission to make such determination. Instead, Section 40 requires a commission's determination on electrical utilities integrated resource plan as a whole, rather than any specific part of the utilities IRP. Additionally, ORS is concerned with the proposition that matters that could have been litigated or raised in an integrated resource plan proceeding should not be relitigated in future procurement, siting, and rate proceedings before this commission, unless there's a change in circumstances. This conflicts directly with the plain language of 583740C4, which states the submission, review, and acceptance of an integrated resource plan by the commission or the inclusion of any specific resource experience in an accepted IRP shall not be determinative of the reasonableness of prudence of the acquisition or construction of any resource or the making of any expenditure. Our witnesses have testified that there are 6 recommendations that ORS have not been resolved. And I will briefly go through that. But to note, in ORS Witness Salter's rebuttal, Table 1, pages 3 to 6, outlines all of ORS's recommendation, including the ones that we consider that are not resolved. E2, ORS recommended that Duke Energy comply with Commission Order 2023-189 to model both company-owned and purchase power agreement solar as selectable resource options, and not to arbitrarily limit the selection of PPA solar resources in the 2025 IRP update. And that recommendation was put forth by ORS witness Wellborn. F2, ORS recommend that Duke Energy evaluate the optimal retirement date for Blues Creek and Mill 1 coal units without the requirement that all coal units must be retired by 2036 in the 2025 IRP update. F4, ORS recommended that Duke Energy perform mini-max regret analyses to include carbon dioxide price as a key risk variable in future IRPs and IRP updates. And a recommendation that has been discussed quite extensively during this proceeding is ORS recommendation F5. ORS, and this recommendation was proposed by ORS witness Hayed and further explained by ORS witness Salter. ORS recommends that the company produce a variation of P0 portfolio optimized using the company's base CO2 price forecast in rebuttal testimony. The company should also evaluate the risk of the portfolio using the mini-max regret analysis framework for performance under the CO2 price, fuel price, and capital cost sensitivities. And further explaining Mr. Salter's testimony, ORS recommends that the companies be required to produce and provide resource plan development strictly to comply with the EPA CAA Section 111 final rule requirements without the 70% carbon emission reduction constraint. This portfolio should be fairly evaluated using mini-max regret analyses framework to be performed under CO2 price, fuel price, and costs and capital cost sensitivities. And like I said, that's on page 22 of Mr. Witness Finley Salter's rebuttal. So F8, ORS recommends that Duke Energy take all reasonable and prudent measures following the 2023 IRP to identify optimal generation resources to support its load forecast beyond 2030. These steps can include, but not limited to, all source RFP to acquire additional long-term capacity resources. And finally, ORS recommends Duke Energy perform production cost model benchmark studies every 3 years in conjunction with comprehensive IRPs. and report such results to the stakeholder working group. Chair Powers, Vice Chair Williams, and members of the commission, based on the information presented during this proceeding, ORS requests the following. Accept and approve ORS's recommendations as outlined in its testimony, the report, and explained throughout testimony during this hearing. And finally, grant its motion for declaratory judgment and motion to strike that were filed in these dockets. Thank you, and I appreciate you having the opportunity to speak before you.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. Who's the lucky one?
5 minutes, Mr. Chair. Hang in there. Thank you for your time, your attention, your endurance, your great questions throughout the course of this hearing. I've appreciated it. Chair Powers, this has been a really well-run hearing. Tight ship, kudos, and thank you for that. I said during my opening statement that the company's witnesses would put up a strong case during this hearing in support of our recommended portfolio, P3 Fall Base, and I think we've done that. We've put up 21 subject matter experts on a variety of issues, a variety of things that we're looking at over the course of this hearing. You heard, for example, system operator Sam Holman discuss the importance of a diverse portfolio and how that helps the companies mitigate risk when it comes to system operations. You heard Mr. Snyder, who's been in this business for 35 years, talk about how every resource has risk associated with it, but how a diverse, all of the above resource mix is not just a catchphrase. It helps to diversify the portfolio and mitigate risk for our customers. You heard Mr. Verderami testify that the decline of the coal market and the supply chain and the increasing age of our coal plants make keeping those plants online longer risky. You heard Mr. Capps, who's managed our nuclear fleet for 37 years, testify that small modular reactors are not a new technology, that it's just a matter of scale. And it was his professional opinion that we can execute on those resources to get them online by 2035. You heard Ms. Smith say twice that a goal without a plan is a wish. The companies have a plan, and they've presented that plan to you throughout the course of this hearing. Secretary of Commerce Lightsey recently testified before the Senate Special Committee that we have to get moving to build new generation to meet economic development load in this state. We are ready to do that. One of the questions that's come up during the course of this hearing is what has changed? The answer to that question from the witness was that we had more detail in our near-term action plan. The truth is we have a lot of work to do to get moving to prepare for that load. Let me tell you what hasn't changed. The companies remain unwaveringly committed to reliability. The companies remain committed to meeting their obligation to serve our customers in South Carolina. The companies remain committed to pursuing a diverse, balanced, affordable resource portfolio to help mitigate resource risk and ensure that the lights come on when our customers flip the switch. If there's a resource that y'all think is too risky or too expensive, we'd like to know that. We heard some reticence about offshore wind. The Commission does not believe that the cost information gathering activities that we have planned in the near term are reasonable. We'd like to know that. We have another executable pathway that retains all of the important features of P3 Fall Base without offshore wind, and that portfolio is compliant with the EPA's regulations. So we don't need a modified IRP. That portfolio is already in the record for this Commission's consideration. We don't want to be stuck in purgatory. Who knows what new recommendations would come from further modeling as we continue to run modeling on the recommendations of other parties. We've already established through our subject matter experts that P0 is not executable, and there's no evidence in the record that contradicts that point. As related to P3 Fall Base, our recommended portfolio, not only did we justify that portfolio under South Carolina law in the IRP's 7 balancing factors, we did that with no credible counter evidence. We've been hard at work at this for a long time. We started stakeholder engagement back in February of 2023 to get the right resource mix in front of this Commission. Other parties threw some darts during the course of this hearing, a lot of discussion about North Carolina law, and I warned y'all about that in my opening statement. But nothing that changes or contradicts the executability of P3 Fall Base or its full compatibility with South Carolina law and policy, which we've explained exhaustively over the course of this hearing. Deviating from this foundation of South Carolina law, ORS's consultant seeks directives from the Commission that have no root in this state's law, proposing market reform through all-source procurement. That, respectfully, that's a state policy issue that's not properly before this Commission. We've already heard that the companies use competitive practices when sourcing new resources, and as Ms. Smith stated, we are never looking to outsource our obligation to serve our customers. We take that obligation very seriously. We learned that ORS's consultant did its own modeling, but they didn't file it with the commission. The parties didn't get it. So even though parties have their own burden under the statute to proffer alternative plans, no party did that in this proceeding. The fact is, nobody other than the companies put forth and justified a portfolio that matches up with South Carolina's balancing factors as being the most reasonable and prudent plan. Finally, and in conclusion, this hearing has been a good education opportunity. I myself have learned a lot over the past year and over the past week, but it's time to get moving on new resources to meet the needs of our customers. We are ready to do that with the Commission's approval of P3 Fall Base. Again, I appreciate your time. I thank you for all the work that you've done to understand our case and to execute on South Carolina law.
Thank you, Mr. Welborn, and I want to take this chance to thank everyone who's here. This has been a long hearing, but as much time as we put in the hearing, there's been a multiple amount of work done behind the scenes by all parties, and it's very much appreciated. I want to thank our commissioners, particularly. They all have worked hard. Our staff has worked hard. They're the ones that are not here are watching us remotely. And particularly I want to thank Ms. Wessinger Hill. This is one of the first major hearings I've had to handle, and she's managed to keep me between the lines pretty well. She will get with you about some sort of date as far as proposed orders, not today, but at a later time.
Yes, sir, I can do that, or if the parties, including the ones virtually, want to hang on so we can talk with the court reporter and discuss some options.
Okay. However you want to do it. But thank all for your hard work. I think we all are looking toward the future, and it has been a good education and just good ideas. I have children, I have grandchildren, and they want to turn on the lights too. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.